Part 2. Mussolini, Hitler, and Haile Selassie. Questions undermining the Ethiopian arc. Chapter 8. When word of Menelik's victory at Adwa hit the news in Italy in 1896, Benito Mussolini was 13 years old and at school. It was a blow to his impressionable mind, writes World War II historian Barry Pitt. The 10,000 dead were still hammering around in his head, and he believed that the Ethiopians had perpetrated the most barbaric atrocities on Italian prisoners. In 1935, the fascist dictator used Adwa as the rallying cry for his return invasion of Ethiopia and the opening salvo for his new Roman Empire. "The great account opened in 1896, cried Mussolini, and must be settled at all costs. Facing Mussolini's giant army from Addis Ababa and the south was Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, also known as Ras Tafari, his given name at birth. He was age 3 when his father, General Makonnen Wolde Mikhail, served as the right-hand man to Emperor Menelik II at the battles of Mekelle and Adwa. As governor of the eastern coffee trading city of Harar, Makonnen replaced the largest mosque there and built the first Christian church, according to Menelik's instructions. Makonnen placed his son under the teaching of a Christian monk, so Tafari was raised in the faith of Christ. Makonnen and his young son Tafari were both in the line of Solomon and candidates to be Ethiopia's future emperor. However, Tafari's father died early. Menelik, instead of choosing Tafari or other qualified kings and princes in the country, appointed as the heir apparent his grandson, Iyasu. Menelik demanded an oath from those watching the ceremony for the new crown prince. "May those who break this oath of loyalty give birth to black dogs." Being named crown prince did not guarantee that Iyasu would become emperor. Tafari was an underrated competitor. Both princes were teenagers when Emperor Menelik II died in 1913. Biographer Osfowoson Osorati, who is kinder to Iyasu than many historians, describes the great contrast. Tafari, the future Haile Selassie, who was naturally slight, was a quiet and reserved boy with a studious and disciplined character. Iyasu was the precise opposite, tall and athletic. He was mad about sport and had an aggressive disposition. He shunned reading, preferring to spend his time in bars and brothels. The two cousins did not get along well. Adding to their morals and lifestyles as dividers, the crown prince was also rumored to be courting Muslim leaders to gain support for his future empire. At this time, Iyasu was several inches taller than Tafari Makonnen, and the 5'2" son of Makonnen never got any taller than a, quote, stunted teenager, explains Makila, the Eritrean historian. With his predilection for sweeping military capes and oversized pith helmets, the effect could be downright comic. From a distance, it looked as though a willful child had been let loose on his father's wardrobe. On the other hand, she mentions his wizened features and quotes another biographer who describes his inner eminence. A later rival warned, "Do not underestimate the power of Tafari. He creeps like a mouse, but has jaws like a lion." Iyasu was losing admiration from the aristocracy for a number of reasons, not least that he was sleeping with some of their wives, daring the husbands to respond. He also displayed petty arrogance. For example, he once ordered his Minister of Defense, Habti Georgis, to dismount in his presence. "How dare you address me while you are still on horseback?" he demanded. But as soon as the minister got down from his horse, the crown prince told him, "Now you may get back in the saddle." Tafari, in contrast, had a lighter touch when he later reached the status of crown prince. Writes an observer at a cabinet meeting, Ras Tafari entered the room, dressed in his official robes and with a prince's crown on his head. He walked up to the war minister and kissed his feet. To try and provoke Ras Tafari, I asked, Do you really think these narrow shoulders of yours will be strong enough to support such a great land as Ethiopia?" Rastafari just smiled benignly and replied, "I'll find everything easy with masters like you to guide me." When Iyasu remained in Muslim territory during Easter, the Christian priests were scandalized. He had been seen wearing a turban and holding Muslim prayer beads. Then word came that he had built a mosque in the Wollo region, prayed there, and prostrated himself toward Mecca. Menelik's daughter, Zaditu, the crown prince's aunt, reached out to have the future emperor placed under her personal custody and, quote, be brought back to Christ and salvation under her guidance. Some historians believe that Iyasu, as officially crowned emperor, would have united the entire Horn of Africa under Islamic law. Alarmed, the leaders of the church and Christian state convened to bring formal charges. 1. Lij Iyasu followed Islamic practice in taking 4 wives, all of whom came from Muslim homes. 2. Rather than trace his ancestry back to the genealogy of Menelik I, he claimed instead to be a descendant in the 40th generation of the Prophet Muhammad. 3. He used government funds to build a mosque. 4. Rather than attending the funeral of Menelik II, he played polo instead. The Council of Church and State officials was chaired by the same Minister of Defense whom Iyasu had humiliated by demanding he dismount and remount his horse. The leaders determined that the crown prince had converted to the Muslim faith. As such, he was excommunicated from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and deposed. His aunt Zaditu was named empress on a temporary basis, as the Ethiopian tradition prefers male rulers. Rastafari was named crown prince and the new heir apparent. Zaditu remained empress for over a decade, but Rastafari, as regent, in many ways ran the government. He took the opportunity during this unstable power struggle to strengthen his position to ultimately become emperor, which was still no certainty. In fact, biographer Osfo Woson suggests the aristocrats wanted Tafari as a token leader because he was a, quote, political lightweight who kissed the feet of the nobility. It would appear that the princes were after a weak regent without strong dynastic ties, whose strings they could pull, and Tafari Makonnen appeared to fit this bill admirably. But they misjudged the true stature of the prince. Rastafari had read his Machiavelli, writes Osfo Woson. Over the following 12 years, he would gradually manage to eliminate all his opponents. He was wily, according to biographer Harold Marcus. So wily was Tafari that no one remarked on his wiliness. Rastafari was endowed with radiant charisma, writes Tafari's longtime legal advisor John Spencer. Diminutive, speaking in a low, grating voice with great economy of gesture, he effortlessly commanded the rapt attention of all who came into his presence. Indeed, his reserved, almost unassuming demeanor seemed to act as a foil to set off his aura of authority. In 1930, Empress Zaditu fell ill and died of a typhoid-like fever. Barely 24 hours later, Tafari made the following statement to the people of Ethiopia. Proclamation. His Majesty King Tafari Makonnen, on his ascent to the imperial throne under the name of His Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings of Ethiopia. And so from the throne of David to which I am now called, I will watch over you with the help of God's grace. He was 37 years old. His new name meant Power of the Trinity. His full name was actually, by the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings of Ethiopia, elect of God. Some, even today, complain that Lion of Judah was a name reserved only for Christ. The criticism accompanies many other concerns during his rule, where the modernizing vision of the new emperor clashed with the nation's conservative traditions. And yet his insistence on monarchy over democracy never wavered. Neither did his commitment to the ancient Christian faith of Ethiopia. Conservatively, Haile Selassie also fought for the term elect of God, for his constitutional name, believing he truly was chosen by God for the task. The Constitution also specified that in the Solomonic dynasty, Haile Selassie was the 225th successor of Menelik I to ascend the Ethiopian throne. Liberally, he initiated the Constitution himself, a device often rejected by autocrats and a concept Zewde refused to implement. A fan of technology, he immediately oversaw improvements in the electric and telegraph systems, cars and road buildings, schools, hospitals, and the creation of a central bank independent of Egypt. Even more significantly, he began the process of removing the Ethiopian church from the oversight of Coptic Egypt's Alexandrian patriarch, calling for Ethiopia's own patriarch, and establishing an autonomous Orthodox church after 1,500 years of dependency. At his coronation ceremony, however, Western reporters noted the backwardness. It is absurd to pretend that Ethiopia is a civilized nation in any Western sense of the word, wrote the New York Times, noting that a major commercial center, Harar, could only be reached by a 2-day mule ride up the circuitous mountain caravan route. King George V of England revealed that he held the same notion of, quote, the uncivilized Abyssinian, when he greeted Haile Tekle Haymanot, the Ethiopian representative in London, years before at George's coronation with Queen Mary. The British reports in the file dubbed Ras Haile as uneducated. The new king asked Haile questions through an interpreter. Can you speak English? No. French? No. Arabic? No. Well, what do you speak? He asked with some indignation. Can you speak Amharic, Galinga, Gurage? Haile asked the king. No. I am glad to see that we are both equally ignorant. In a later diplomatic visit to London via Cairo, the Ethiopian delegation's shoes were the main focus of the newspapers. A New York Times headline said, Ethiopian royalties don shoes in Cairo. While correctly remembering that most Ethiopian soldiers still went barefoot, the reporters assumed this was the first time Ethiopian dignitaries had ever put shoes on their feet. Great Britain was among the many nations represented at Haile Selassie's coronation in 1930, along with Italy, Japan, Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, Egypt, France, the United States, Germany, Turkey, and Greece. The act of anointing was the central element in the ritual. Just as Zadok the priest anointed King David and Nathan anointed Solomon, so I anoint you with sacred myrrh, the ranking church official proclaimed as he applied the oil. He charged the emperor to faithfully obey the teachings of the Gospels. Tafari and his wife, Menenhasfa, the empress, received communion as the new royal couple. Soon, Haile Selassie would be named Time magazine's Man of the Year. He had reached his great goal as King of Kings, Nagusa Nagast in Ethiopia's Amharic language. However, that pinnacle also meant becoming the victim of untold cruelty by one of history's most ruthless dictators, and being a central character in the greatest war the world has ever seen. In 1911, during the time Haile Selassie was about to receive the news of Emperor Menelik's death, Benito Mussolini was revealing his secrets in a journal he wrote from prison. The young Italian, who decried the country's disgrace at Adwa, received a 5-month sentence for sedition. As a radical socialist and newspaper editor, he had called for the end of the current government and opposed military involvement on the eve of the First World War. The national flag is for us a rag to be planted in a dunghill, he declared. He also condemned Italy's war against Turkey for control of Libya. In a speech, he called on the Italian people to declare a national strike, block the streets, and stop the trains. In another speech, he was just as adamant. May the masses cry out with one voice, and may their cry resound through the streets and squares of Italy. Down with war! The day has come for the Italian proletariat to obey its vow of old. We won't send a single soldier. We won't give a single penny, whatever it takes. Raised by a socialist blacksmith who read Karl Marx's Das Kapital to him at night, Mussolini embraced with ease the socialist and free love movement that swept the liberal elite at the turn of the century. Across the Atlantic, feminist and birth control advocate Margaret Sanger, one of the many high-profile free love radicals of the time, boasted of a new religion emerging with no definite name. She said that they were agnostics, freethinkers, or atheists, and, quote, as fanatical in their faith in the coming revolution as ever any primitive Christian was for the immediate establishment of the kingdom of God, unquote. Mussolini emerged from prison a socialist star and was feted at a banquet. A man there proclaimed him the leader, the Duce in Italian, and the nickname stuck. The socialist press described his style as fascinating and compelling, his voice like a forest murmur, his gestures like someone haunted by a nightmare. A Socialist Party leader sang his praises. The party has the good fortune to be led by a man who is upright and honest. He has incomparable moral force, driven, like all such moral forces, by ruthless logic. But what kind of morality? With Mussolini, the people generally chose to see only what they wanted to see. The Duce was expelled from his village school for 3 different knifing incidents. He stabbed a fellow student in the hand who started to scream at first with the pain and then at the sight of blood squirting everywhere. The second student he stabbed in the buttocks. The third victim was a woman, but no details are known of the incident. He does provide details of a early sexual encounter while still in school with a girl named Virginia, recorded in his journal from prison. One fine day, when everyone else was in Verano and had gone to San Cassiano to listen to some pompous sermon from a friar, I led her up some stairs, pushed her into a corner behind a door, and had her on the spot. When she got up, she was distressed and crying and started to insult me. Our affair lasted 3 months. Let's just say it was more a meeting of bodies than of souls. He also shares that his first sexual experience was, in fact, at a brothel. This tryst and his encounter with Virginia add credence to the reports that the sexually charged Duce was not a classic ladies' man, but shabby, dirty, touchy, and morose, according to an ex-lover from his free love circles. Most of his early sexual activity was spawned at socialist dances, where it was acceptable within that crowd to find partners, married or otherwise. One such partner, Giulietta, was beautiful and married with a child. Our relationship lasted a few weeks until we were found out. Her husband heard about it and ordered his wife to be driven away from the house. She took her little boy with her and joined me in the room where we'd first come together. Another of his married partners had 5 children. Mussolini had taken one of his first jobs out of school as a teacher in a small town. His debut as a socialist speaker occurred when he agreed to debate a Christian spokesman in the town. 500 people packed the hall. When the chairman of the discussion asked him to speak, Mussolini got to his feet, asked someone to lend him a watch, and then issued an ultimatum. If at the end of 5 minutes he had not been struck down by the hand of God, this was a proof the deity didn't exist. Seeing that he was addressing citizens living in the center of worldwide Roman Catholicism, some criticism might be expected. Instead, he was warmly applauded. His teaching stint was not successful. Parents of the young girls he had seduced stepped in. With brisk determination, they would carry their daughter back home, putting a firm stop to any hopes of marriage with an unruly and notorious young man. His sister Edwige, however, believed her brother was ready to marry these girls. She said he seemed to want it so convincingly. Mussolini had written an article for an anti-clerical publication, The Whip, where he used the pen name A True Heretic. Parents and church authorities lobbied to have him removed from his position. Soon he met his future wife, Rochelle, a young blonde from a town in northern Italy. She was blooming, buxom, with nice breasts, attractive. I followed her around, paid court to her. She pleased me. One day I got her down on the armchair, and in my usual way, roughly took her virginity. This time he was ready to marry. "I'm fond of her because she lets me do whatever I want to do," Mussolini wrote. He continued to go to socialist dances and practice free love, but he forbade Rochelle from attending them. As good socialists, they had no church wedding service. The Duce had a special dislike for religion. He particularly liked to ridicule Jesus, describing him as an ignorant Jew and claiming that he was a pygmy compared to Buddha, writes Jonah Goldberg in his book on Mussolini and Fascism. Any socialist who practiced religion or even tolerated it in their children should be expelled from the party. Mussolini demanded that party members renounce religious marriage, baptism, and all other Christian rituals. He was certainly talented. He was an amateur violinist, spoke several languages, was well-read, and was a prolific writer. The Avanti newspaper appointed him chief editor, one of the more powerful posts in the country. He was also violent. He beat his wife and, in one encounter, brandished a gun to both Rochelle and her mother. They backed off, but a few of his lovers did not. Ida Dulcer, who bore the Duce an illegitimate child, showed up in the street one day outside his newspaper offices. Holding little Benito in her arms, she yelled up to him, "You coward, you pig, you murderer, traitor, come out if you dare." A number of people wandered out to see what the trouble was. Mussolini raced down the stairs with a revolver. "That's it, I've had enough, I'm going to deal with you once and for all." Before he could act further, she was led away by police. Lita Raffanelli provided a different type of encounter. They didn't meet in free love circles. Instead, she wrote for the Avanti newspaper. A Muslim interested in Sufism, but also a well-read socialist, she entranced the Duce with a more exotic experience. "You made me feel I was in the marvelous and mysterious Orient, with its intense perfumes and its mad, fascinating fantasies," he told her. Early on, he made this proposal: "We shall read Nietzsche and the Koran," alluding to the most popular philosopher of the day among radicals, Germany's Friedrich Nietzsche. Their lengthy affair was upset by her learning he had a wife and child. "Why have you always lied to me?" she asked. "You always told me you knew anyway." "But you always denied it," she countered. "You told me that if I knew you had a wife or you were living with another woman, I would break off our friendship." "It doesn't matter whether I have a wife or not. She's used to my infidelities. She's a good woman." In her autobiography, the matronly Rochelle Mussolini, who was mother to 5 of his children, alludes to her husband's serial adultery. He never denied that he was attracted to women, with one misgiving which one day he revealed to me: "You will always be the only beautiful woman in my life, because beauty is untrustworthy. It can make even the wisest man lose his head." He got into fistfights with husbands and squarely punched a lawyer he was opposing on political matters. Nevertheless, the Duce was rising to the top of the Socialist Party's leadership and becoming a populist leader throughout Italy. In the same way his wife looked past his infidelities, the Italian nation looked past Mussolini's character in favor of its need for a strong leader. Rather than sexual impropriety serving as a warning, it instead became the central feature of the, quote, myth of Mussolini that launched his meteoric rise. These times were chaotic, similar to the late 60s in America, but worse. Europe was reeling from strikes that led to violence, as well as from assassinations, terrorist bombings, and the threat of looming great wars. Italy was unstable. Civil war was a possibility. According to biographer Roberto Ola, the times called for a strong man which would nurture the Duce as the great lover, the alpha male, who was potent in every sense of the term. Writes Ola, "Many rumors about Mussolini's potency circulated among women, whispered no doubt accompanied by blushes, during his 20-year dictatorship, and in the same way anecdotes tinged with envy were bandied about among men. The myth included Mussolini's closely shaved Roman head, which fascinated women, Mussolini's jutting square jaw, Mussolini with his cat, on his horse, playing his violin, fondling his pet lion, driving his torpedo in swimming trunks, with his blazing eyes and powerful naked torso, with the look of gritty determination at the wheel of his racing car, or an air of daring at the controls of his plane. His Muslim lover wrote for publication this sentiment on first hearing him speak: "Benito Mussolini is the socialist of the heroic times. He feels, he still believes, with an enthusiasm full of virility and force. He is a man." In the same way that Rochelle allowed her husband's smooth words to cover his lies and adultery, the Italian people chose Mussolini's rhetoric espousing peace and the rule of law. They were willing to ignore the growing rumors that tactics of violence by, quote, armed squads were a part of his rising success. "Whenever I spoke to my brother about the phenomenon of the armed squads," writes Sister Avige, his response ranged from outright and bitter denunciation to a lightly condescending irony. However, the peaceful rhetoric was getting in the Duce's way. His popularity was almost strong enough to propel him to prime minister, the country's top position, above the king, similar to England. But the patriotic, nationalistic call to enter World War I was still stronger. Mussolini had made large promises to his socialist base, many of whom were pacifists. His next move involved treating his fellow socialists the same way he treated his women. The social radicals of the day all had one intellectual mentor in common: philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. The phrase "God is dead" was made popular by this young thinker. "Christianity remains to this day the greatest misfortune of humanity," he wrote in one of his last books, The Antichrist. Birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger was attending lectures on Nietzsche in London around the same time Benito Mussolini was devouring a biography of Nietzsche as a young teacher. No hero or preacher of egoism had as much an influence on him as the philosopher-poet Friedrich Nietzsche, writes biographer Laura Fermi. This German professor called for the will to power to replace God and inspired followers to become supermen, elite thinkers who transcended traditional morality. As Mussolini put it, each of us is free to create his own ideology. Sanger considered Nietzsche a genius. Agreeing with the German professor's ideas, Sanger called for the end of the tyranny of Christian leaders and traditional morality. Birth control appeals to the advanced radical, she printed in her birth control review, because it is calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian churches. The same article predicts, quote, the downfall of the church. Like the Duce, she had multiple sex partners in a given month. She promoted, quote, a new sex morality with a clear religious goal. Through sex, mankind may attain the great spiritual illumination which will transform the world, which will light up the only path to an earthly paradise. She advised her 16-year-old granddaughter that sex 3 times a day was about right. Her husband, William Sanger, an attorney, protested with Margaret for better wages for women and was even locked up advocating for birth control. But when Margaret fell under the spell of the radical's radical, Emma Goldman, a free sex anarchist imprisoned for attempted assassination, he scurried Margaret away to Europe to keep the family together. Her next mentor was Havelock Ellis, the celebrated author of a 7-volume series on sex, who also became one of Margaret's lovers. The Sangers divorced. William Sanger called the socialist revolution simply, quote, an excuse for a saturnalia of sex. Biographer Madeline Gray says William was sick of hearing Emma hammer away at the idea that marriage and fidelity were among the chief curses of mankind. Sanger and Mussolini also built upon Nietzsche's words regarding race and breeding. In 1880, Nietzsche wrote, "The testimony must be towards the rendering extinct of the wretched, the deformed, the degenerate. Elites, rather than the masses, should be in charge of reproduction, he said, so that race as a whole no longer suffers, noting that the extinction of many types of people is just as desirable as any form of reproduction. Nietzsche went insane at age 33. Those years of madness included claims that he created the world. He signed his letters, "The Crucified One." He died at age 44 from syphilis. He may have been projecting his own tendencies onto the masses when he said before his madness, "Go through the towns and ask yourselves whether these people should reproduce. Let them go to their whores." After losing popularity from being associated with Hitler's ideas, Nietzsche has been resurrected as an esteemed thinker today. Stanford University notes that he is even read by cultural icons like Shaquille O'Neal and Marilyn Manson. Modern scholars seek to disassociate Nietzsche from the Führer, but there is a similar ring in Hitler's proclamation that the demand that defective people be prevented from propagating equally defective offspring is a demand of the clearest reason, and all great cultures of the past perished only because the originally creative race died off through blood poisoning. Who will serve the heroes and supermen? Nietzsche names the, quote, subhumans as their natural attendants. Sanger uses similar terms, as she called openly for using birth control and sterilization as ways to eliminate, quote, human waste. She agreed that the noblest and most difficult art of all is the raising of human thoroughbreds. In fact, the masthead of her Birth Control Review magazine said, "Birth control, to create a race of thoroughbreds." Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, the largest performer of abortions in the world, and a multi-billion-dollar operation today. In 1925, Sanger hosted a Neo-Malthusian conference at the Hotel McAlpin in New York in honor of 19th century anti-population doomsday writer Thomas Malthus, another man admired by Mussolini. At the conference, she stated, "Year by year, more money is expended to maintain an increasing race of morons, which threatens the very foundation of our civilization." Malthus taught that population grows geometrically, or exponentially, but resources and food only grow arithmetically, or incrementally. While Malthus himself was not a scientist or demographer, he was an Anglican clergyman, his views fit perfectly with Margaret's desire to make birth control legal for women, as she promoted, quote, weeding out the unfit, preventing the birth of defectives, and decried war, which kills not the weak and the helpless, but the strong and the fit. She also quoted with sympathy an activist who called for humans to model animals. If men insisted that those who were sickly should be allowed to die without help of medicine or science, if those who are weak were put upon one side and crushed, if those who were old and useless were killed, if those who are not capable of providing food for themselves were allowed to starve, the struggle for existence among men would be as real as it is among brutes and would doubtless result in the production of a higher race of men. "We are not willing to let it be done," Margaret laments. "Mothers' hearts cling to children, no matter how diseased, misshapen, or miserable." This thinking of the day is known as Eugenics, and later became quite unpopular when Hitler used the same premises to conduct his Nazi ethnic cleansing campaigns. Today, followers of Sanger seek to downplay the hundreds of on-the-record embarrassments. But even sympathetic biographers call it indefensible and admit that Margaret's support of eugenics ultimately cost her some of her reputation, according to Jean H. Baker. Today, its atrocities have no justification. Malthusianism was also helpful for Mussolini, who believed that Africans were, quote, inferior. He told the Senate in 1919 that continued population increase would cause misery and hunger because of the poverty of Italy's economic endowments. According to Maria Kine in From Malthus to Mussolini, Thus, his solution for Italy's current overpopulation problem was to invade and colonize. Mussolini saw high birth rates in Africa and Asia as a threat to the white race. His speeches involved the cry, "Are the blacks and yellows at the door?" "Yes, they are," came the reply. He also believed that the United States was doomed, as the American blacks had a higher birth rate than whites. Sanger seemed to hold similar notions. In 1939, she designed a Negro Project for Southern health officials who were not known for their racial equanimity, as dryly noted by George Grant in his expose of Planned Parenthood. As one contributor to Sanger's Birth Control Review wrote, "It is the lower elements of the population, the Negroid aboriginal tribes, and the pariahs or outcasts who are gaining the fastest." Sanger's same magazine published a favorable review by her lover, Havelock Ellis, of the book The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy by Lathrop Stoddard. Ellis notes that Stoddard chooses to concern himself mainly with the maintenance of white supremacy. Ellis agrees that by prejudice of color, we must mostly be on his side in this matter. Ellis also shares his concern about African Americans. The migration of lower types, even within the white world, such as those that have worked havoc in the United States, must be rigorously curtailed, he said. Ellis also wrote the preface to Sanger's 1920 book, Woman and the New Race. In a later Birth Control Review article, Sanger calls for giving certain dysgenic groups in our population their choice of segregation or sterilization. She also published an article by close friend and advisor Ernst Rudin, who was then serving as Hitler's director of genetic sterilization for the Nazis. It was entitled Eugenic Sterilization, an Urgent Need. With Mussolini holding the same Nietzschean and Malthusian views as Sanger, one wonders if he reached his goal as prime minister, how he might implement his ideas on the Ethiopian people, whose defeat of Italy at Adwa he sought to avenge. In later memos, he would even give orders to, quote, exterminate. Chapter 9. Secret agents of the Italian government followed Benito Mussolini minute by minute now that he was one of the country's most high-profile figures, head of the Socialist Party and leading candidate for the country's highest position. They knew all about the affairs. Agent Giovanni Gasti remarked on the Duce's strong physical constitution, despite his syphilis, which allows him to work uninterruptedly for long periods. The myth of Mussolini was growing at a breakneck pace. His sights were on the top post of prime minister, but he was trapped in his 10 years of anti-war leadership among a people in a patriotic fervor for war, like many other nations in Europe. Gasti also noted Mussolini's changeable political views, adding hope that he could be turned into a government informant and collaborator. He had the ability, quote, to change direction and help to undermine institutions and principles that he has hitherto supported and advocated. His Muslim lover, Lita Raffanelli, aware of his personal lies, also saw the ideological wavering. Far from being tough and intransigent, biographer Ola reports from her memoirs, the Duce switched opinions and changed his mind easily, and rapidly abandoned positions which only a moment before had appeared to be unchangeable beliefs. As late as August 1914, Mussolini wrote an article entitled, "Down with War, We Remain Neutral." But true to character, he changed his position and penned his reversal in the leading socialist publication that he oversaw as editor. "The sentiment of nationality exists and cannot be denied," he wrote. He described the old way as international socialism, and he called for a new national socialism. It was necessary, quote, to assassinate the party in order to save socialism. He resigned from the newspaper Avanti and formed the new Fascist Party, the name taken from fascio, a bundle of sticks bound together to hold an axe head. Women prefer men to be brutal, he once said, and he believed the same about his former socialist friends, who had removed him from the party for his newfound warmongering. You hate me today because you love me still, he told them. You think you can turn me out, but you will find that I shall come back again. I am and shall remain a socialist, and my convictions will never change. They are bred into my very bones. Later, Mussolini's fascist squads destroyed socialist newspapers and attacked the Avanti offices. He began writing, quote, quite violent articles for his new fascist paper, and called for a man ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep of the country. His squads were called black shirts because Italian special forces wore black turtlenecks that quickly became vogue among fascists. They clashed with communists, socialists, and anarchists at parades and demonstrations. The government stood back, fearing an all-out revolution, some hoping the black shirts might bring order to the growing chaos. The government most feared the communist Reds, who organized a transportation strike on July 31st, 1922. Officials looked the other way as the black shirts broke up the strike, drove the streetcars, kept the traffic moving, and, quote, made the trains run on time. Writes Goldberg, Mussolini's strike-breaking tactics had a profound effect on the Italian public. At a time when intellectuals all over the world were growing cynical about parliamentary democracy and liberal politics, Mussolini's military efficiency seemed to transcend partisan politics. The public ignored the fact that the tactics included assaults on the vulnerable and violent abuse, including raping women and pushing sticks up men's rectums, according to Roberto Alla. Fascist squads had knifed and beaten many politicians, intellectuals, trade unionists, journalists, even priests, Alla wrote. The list of those who had been killed was long. Hitler, a decade from prominence, watched Mussolini at this time and used him as a model for violence. As one newsreel reported it, Adolf Hitler, only a promising amateur in those days, came to study and emulate the master fascist, Mussolini. The Duce made a strange peace with the Vatican and had his family baptized. He had not yet become prime minister, but both church and people had already made their dark pact with a known liar, blasphemer, celebrated adulterer, and suspected murderer. The Pope said he was sent by Providence. He still despised the church. A few years before, while making a living as a writer, he produced a highly popular novel about a priest who breaks his vow. Mussolini provided intimate details of all the priest's sexual transgressions. Instead of promoting the church, he proclaimed that fascism is a religion. Compared to the competition, we declare ourselves the heretics, he said. Spirits endowed with sublime perversity is what Mussolini said he wanted as he described the contrast. Christianity said, be mortified. The Nietzschean Superman wants instead to conquer. In late October 1922, 30,000 fascist black shirts gathered in the capital to demand the resignation of Prime Minister Luigi Facta and the appointment of a new fascist government. It is now known as the March on Rome. Mussolini waited in the city of Milan. The country still looked to King Vittorio Emanuele III as the ultimate head of the military. The king refused Prime Minister Facta's request to institute martial law. Facta resigned, and King Vittorio asked Mussolini to draw up a new fascist government. Behind the scenes, King Vittorio Emanuele had already asked him to form a new government, writes Goldberg. But the Duce marched anyway, reenacting Julius Caesar's March on Rome and giving the new fascist government a useful revolutionary myth that he would artfully exploit in years to come. Mussolini became prime minister, and fascist Italy was born. Parliament granted the Duce dictatorial powers for 1 year, legal according to the Constitution. But within 3 years, all semblance of a democracy was gone. Mussolini's title was changed from prime minister to head of government. He was no longer answerable to Parliament, and only the king could remove him from the leadership of the military. His myth involved restoring the Roman Empire. He remembered Ardois. Immediately upon obtaining his dictatorial power, he told his defense ministers, "Take all military and diplomatic steps necessary in order that we may profit from a possible collapse of the Ethiopian Empire." Haile Selassie also remembered Ardois. One of his first initiatives as Ethiopia's leader was the bold action of applying for membership in the League of Nations, the forerunner of today's United Nations. The League agreed to discipline its ranks and sanction any of its members that attacked a fellow member nation. Along with approximately 52 others, Italy was a member and adamantly opposed Ethiopia's entry, the first of any African nation to be considered. Despite the difficulties, Ethiopia was voted in as a member nation by the General Assembly of the League of Nations in 1923. "There was great joy in Addis Ababa," said Haile Selassie. "We thought the covenant of the League would protect us." Mussolini had bitter memories of his country's unfair treatment after a great many Italians died in the First World War. Italy was not rewarded at the peace table with the colonial prizes that went to England and France. As the world loomed toward another world war, the Duce was determined to conquer his colonies first. For years, Italy had been conducting a massive buildup of its army. While some diplomats warned leaders like U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the intention of this buildup was for Ethiopia, Mussolini, backed by FDR's ambassador, insisted the forces were to protect the Allies from Hitler invading Austria, the buffer nation between Germany and Italy. The wary U.S. president listened. FDR needed the Duce. He told Italy's finance minister that he considered Mussolini, quote, his only potential ally in this effort to safeguard world peace. Mussolini's ambitions hinged on Roosevelt. Were Italy to invade Ethiopia, he believed Britain and France would not enact economic sanctions required by the League of Nations without Roosevelt's participation. Sanctions would be crippling, according to historians Philip Canestraro and Brian Sullivan. Italy could suffer economic collapse, defeat in East Africa, and the subsequent dishonor of watching Germany seize Austria. Mussolini and probably fascism would be finished. American diplomats in Europe continued to warn Roosevelt of Italian plans to attack Ethiopia. To counter these suspicions, Mussolini beefed up his ongoing public relations campaign in America, resting primarily on columns he wrote for the Hearst newspaper chain. In fact, they were written by his longtime Jewish mistress, Margarita Sarfati. She was attractive, married with children, well-educated, spoke several languages, and was perhaps the primary creator of fascism and the myth of Mussolini. Sarfati wrote his biography entitled Duce, which was printed in 19 languages and sold millions of copies. She understood the appeal of a book that readers suspected was written by someone who had personally partaken of the sex symbol. She also helped him arrange his encounters with hundreds of sexual partners. Mussolini cultivated an impression of being married to all Italian women, writes Goldberg. That myth-making by Sarfati made itself a surreal reality when millions of women donated their gold wedding rings to the state as Italy found itself in financial turmoil. Along with being depicted as a violinist and a bare-chested model, the versions of the symbol now included the swordsman who could ski, hit tennis, and swim. He played with children, and was photographed with flowers and animals. The propaganda was ingenious, even more so than the system created by Hitler and Goebbels in Germany, writes Sarfati biographer Olah. But all these things revolved around or sprang from the idea of Mussolini's sexuality, the image of him as a great lover. When Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, met Mussolini in 1926, she noted his, quote, beautiful golden brown piercing eyes. He fills you with a sort of pleasurable awe. Churchill himself called him the Roman genius and the greatest lawgiver among living men. Mussolini and his mistress, Margherita Sarfati, were unsure if their propaganda was as effective with President Roosevelt. They wrote another article for Hearst's American newspapers comparing FDR's New Deal to the fascist corporate state. The Duce dispatched U.S. Ambassador Breckinridge Long to send Mussolini's sentiment of great personal admiration for the president. FDR replied to Long, "There seems no question but that Mussolini is really interested in what we are doing, and I am much interested and deeply impressed with what he has accomplished and by his evidenced honest purpose of restoring Italy and seeking to prevent general European trouble." Roosevelt's distant relative, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., later a general for FDR, visited Rome, and Sarfati made a point to entertain him at her mansion. As the two began a contest quoting Rudyard Kipling, Teddy was surprised Margherita knew more of the English poet than he did. He later met with Mussolini, but neither face-to-face encounter warmed the Roosevelt nephew, who concluded that Americans would never consent to a dictatorship. Sarfati turned her attention to the American press and arranged an interview of the Duce with New York Times reporter Anne O'Hare McCormick. The resulting headline, "Il Duce insists the chief aim of Italian policy is peace." "I will peace. I need peace," Mussolini was quoted as saying, speaking in clear English according to McCormick. "We must have peace. You say the people look to me to save the peace of Europe? Well, they are right. Italy will never start a war." McCormick revealed her vulnerability to the myth. "By default of other leadership, Rome rides toward her ancient place," she wrote, "and rides with a certain fresh magnificence." The propaganda was working in Europe, as Mussolini determined through his private channels that if he attacked Ethiopia, Britain and France would only post official diplomatic protests. They would not enact economic sanctions. Accordingly, he began to dispatch tanks, guns, and soldiers by the tens of thousands to the Suez Canal toward the Horn of Africa. Ambassador Long had continued to tell FDR that the buildup was to fight Hitler, and the president disagreed and told him so. When reports emerged that over 100,000 members of the Italian army were headed to Ethiopia, Long was forced to admit the obvious. He then excused the invasion plan as the cost for preventing Italy from joining forces with Hitler in Europe. Long fell ill, and FDR replaced him with Alexander Kirk, who finally began feeding accurate reports to the president. Meanwhile, Britain and France polled the public and saw the overwhelming popular support for sanctioning Italy upon an invasion of Ethiopia. The British cabinet held an emergency meeting. Warships sailed to the Mediterranean with threats to blockade Italy and shut the Suez Canal. The Duce guessed they were bluffing. The deciding card still lay with Roosevelt, who now had all the information. He sent secret letters to Mussolini, pleading with him to stop the invasion. Angered, Mussolini threatened war against Europe as well as Ethiopia. He now viewed FDR as an enemy. Sarfati argued with the Duce against the invasion. She was even making plans to leave Italy, fearing economic collapse and political disaster. She told a friend, "It is the beginning of the end." "Why do you say that?" the friend replied. "Do you think we are going to lose this war in Africa?" "No, I say it because unfortunately I think we will win and he will lose his head." Sarfati later wrote a tell-all entitled My fault. There was little repentance in the book, even though she, more than any other, can be attributed to creating Mussolini and his image. She was no hero. Barato, the Duce's chauffeur, referenced the activities overseen by the highly educated mistress as, quote, worthy of a brothel. Those liaisons included, in later years, an arranged affair with Sarfati's teenage daughter. Shapely and pretty, said Barato. I only realized later why she was so often with them. Sullivan confirms the perverse liaison, noting that Mussolini had spent time with little Fiammetta Sarfati since she was a toddler. The chauffeur's observation was confirmed by the maid. He remains attached to the mother because he's in love with the daughter, who's crazy about him. Sarfati's myth-making avoided the less impressive details. The trysts with various women included sex on the office carpet and sex standing up with his boots still on, encounters every day but sheets changed every 3 days, another mistress who helped her mother run a brothel, sometimes more than 2 were in the room, and he had gonorrhea as well as syphilis. More notably, Sarfati's myth was not necessarily true. He sometimes required a Viagra-like drug. He couldn't handle alcohol. His sister chided him for refusing to view a dead body. He melted from certain smells, including ether and incense. In his 50s, Mussolini's tertiary syphilis caused him serious gastrointestinal spasms. He developed an ulcer and vomited blood. When Sarfati was no longer useful to him, Mussolini claimed he could not perform well during their first few sexual encounters because of her Jewish scent, citing, quote, this terrible smell they have. Sarfati escaped a few years later to South America, but her sister and other Jewish relatives were carted off in cattle cars from Italy to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Hitler's Germany. It was to Hitler that Mussolini looked when Britain, France, and the United States threatened to block his invasion of Ethiopia. He made a deal over time not to interfere with a possible German aggression into Austria. He invaded Ethiopia with 476,000 men, 500 tanks, 350 aircraft, 1,500 artillery pieces, and 15,000 machine guns. His commanding general, Emilio de Bono, mounted a white horse and rode into Aksum, the holy city, home of the Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 10. I met Gabriel on the streets of Aksum during a recent trip while I was sipping coffee. He was 19 and was finishing up his civil engineering degree after studying algebra, trigonometry, and advanced calculus. He attends the University of Aksum, which has around 15,000 students and within which English is spoken exclusively in the classroom. Gabriel's family and friends and pretty much everyone else in the community attends church several times a week. Usually it's a simple morning service from 6 to 8 a.m. On feast days, they will arrive at church at 3 a.m. and stay until 9 a.m. This devotion is typical of all those in the neighborhood, he says. For Ethiopian Orthodox across the country, 78% say they attend church at least weekly, compared with 10% of Orthodox Christians in Europe and 31% of Orthodox Christians in the United States. And 90% of Ethiopian Orthodox say religion is very important to them, compared with 52% in the U.S. and 28% in Europe who say this. Gabriel's parents did not know each other before they were married. The way it is traditionally done is a man will notice a young woman, usually a teenager, and tell his parents of his interest. And Gabriel's father's case was typical. The future groom's father will contact the matchmaker in the village, an elderly man. He and the prospective husband's father will then sit down with the young woman's parents and discuss the possibility of a marriage. The girl is never consulted. If everyone approves, then the young man meets with the girl and gives her a ring of promise. A few weeks later, they are married. During those intervening weeks, the future bride and groom meet and get to know each other. Gabriel told me that this period is when sexual relations commence. They can't do it on the wedding day, as they will be too tired from all the festivities. After their sexual relations, just as we read about in the Old Testament, the man will bring to his parents and the elder a blood-stained cloth to show that the woman was a virgin. If she is not a virgin, and the man is a deacon planning to become a priest, he cannot become a priest. And as a deacon, he is not allowed to enter the church altar for the rest of his life. Gabriel does not expect to be married until he is at least 25. The girl will be 19 or 20. His grandmother was 15 and had 15 children. It is possible that his arrangement will be similar to his parents', but modern ways may mean that he gets to know his future wife before introducing her to his parents. In his parents' case, they never had a conversation with each other until they pledged to be married. Haile Selassie gathered his army in Addis Ababa and watched his barefoot soldiers march by in procession. Unlike the 10-to-1 advantage at Adwa, the emperor had 100,000 less soldiers than Italy's 476,000, and 200 outdated artillery guns to Italy's 1,500. The Duce had hundreds of airplanes. Ethiopia had 3. "We watched the curious procession," said Times of London reporter George Steer. "What could they do? They thought they could do everything." Indeed, Haile Selassie said, "Mussolini's formidable problem is the indomitable spirit of the Ethiopian people." All Ethiopians were aware that they had never been colonized. An invasion had never ultimately succeeded, not in all of history. Ethiopia is, quote, "the land of God," according to an official church publication, and she will survive until the end of the world. In 525 BC, Persian conqueror Cambyses defeated Egypt and then invaded Ethiopia, but was repulsed by Ethiopian armies, particularly their archers, who reduced the Persians to cannibalism. Alexander the Great conquered many regions, including Egypt, but chose to avoid Ethiopia. The Romans, too, stopped at Egypt and Meroe, today's Sudan, and Aksum was spared. An advisor to an Egyptian Ptolemy king as he prepared to invade Ethiopia in the 2nd century BC remarked, "Why futilely announce an impossible task?" The earlier referenced church publication comments on its belief that all invaders are doomed, saying any anti-Ethiopian force has hurried their own downfall and will do so in the future. Amharic, the common language for all Ethiopians, originates with the Amhara ethnic group. The word means free people. Ethiopia's ancient liturgical language, known as Ge'ez, derives from the Agazian ethnic group. Agazian also means free people. And Lord of the Free is inscribed in Ge'ez on one of the famous ancient stone pillars, also called obelisks or stelae, erected a stone's throw from where the Ark is kept in Aksum. That stela, or obelisk, was seized by the Italian occupiers. Having been broken into 5 pieces a millennia before, it was taken piece by piece to Rome and reassembled. Like the occult Nazis, the Italians were known to desire such objects. Were they seeking the Ark? Author Enrico Carnucci states that the fascist government was aware of a cryptic map in the obelisk, a notion also discussed in Ethiopian tradition. While they attempted to break the code, lightning struck and damaged the stone map just 2 weeks after it arrived in Italy. Meanwhile, later reports indicate the Ark may have been secreted away by Ethiopian clergy during this period, as they had done in former times of persecution. The most notable secondary location was an island monastery at Lake Tana. Long before Italian forces could secure the area, the Italian Minister of Popular Culture, Alessandro Pavellini, traveled to Lake Tana and boarded a water landing craft. One can only speculate why he took the risk of getting there as soon as possible, writes an investigator at historicmysteries.com. 2 weeks after Mussolini's obvious and brazen invasion, the League of Nations voted to enact economic sanctions in accordance with the Charter's bylaws for any aggression against a member nation. However, it was only an arms and credit embargo and did not include the most important item, oil, and that is what mattered. Mussolini admitted to Hitler that an oil embargo would have forced his immediate retreat. The United States, not a member of the League, even though its then President Woodrow Wilson envisioned it, was under no compulsion to follow Britain and France, and League members decided to wait to see what FDR would do before including oil in their sanctions. Much was at stake. If the League did not take firm action against Mussolini's African campaign, how could they tell Hitler not to invade European members of the League? For his part, Mussolini was convinced he could win the League over if it appeared that the war was won, the occupation inevitable, and any effort by another nation to stop it was a pointless adventure. He needed a quick victory and doubled his troops and forces. Like the final moments of Adwa before the giant conflict, General de Bono was playing a game of chicken with Haile Selassie. He did not want Italy to appear as the aggressor when combat began. However, he reluctantly messaged the Duce, "Haile Selassie is ordering too many prayers and fasts to give us reason to think he wishes to attack us," he wrote. "We ourselves must take the initiative." And yet, the emperor was indeed making plans. He radioed the empress, "Since our trust is in our Creator and in the hope of His help, and as we have decided to advance and enter the Italian fortifications, and since God is our only help, confide this decision of ours in secret to the archbishop, to the ministers and dignitaries, and offer up to God your fervent prayers." Mussolini took to his balcony to make speeches, where he often stated that he had brought civilization to triumph over barbarity, and Italy wants peace for all. Haile Selassie, now an international figure, received letters from across the world. Wrote one woman, "Ethiopia must not lose courage, for God will fight on her behalf and send his angels to protect her." Another one wrote from California, "Whites are not as civilized as they loudly assert themselves to be." Mussolini and Haile Selassie embodied the moral contrast. The Ethiopian emperor never created a scandal involving infidelity. His day began at 5 a.m. with a half an hour of morning prayers. He observed all the church's fast days, and he worked late into the night. A British journalist noted that it was a marvel to me how this frail little man could cram so much work into 24 hours. An impatient Duce replaced General de Bono with General Pietro Badoglio. The wary Italian soldiers advanced southward to the Decezi River and waited with caution. They had heard the reports of Ethiopian castrations at Adwa and believed it could happen again. The emperor's general, Ras Imru, aligned his troops across a mountain crest. An Italian major, Cretini, ordered his tanks to smash a way through them. The tanks lumbered forward, and the Ethiopians engulfed the steel monsters in a mass of human flesh, preventing the crews from using their machine guns and tearing the tracks off. When dusk fell, almost half of Cretini's men lay dead or wounded on the battlefield. When night fell, the Italian commander had lost. This success was an important moral victory for Ethiopia and the first time the massive Italian army withdrew. Badoglio was forced to message an enraged Duce. Ethiopian forces then smashed into Badoglio's right flank. A great Ethiopian counteroffensive began that lasted for another 3 weeks. The former ambassador, Breckinridge Long, was notified of unusual anger in Mussolini's speeches. He wondered with Margherita Sarfatti if Mussolini were about to take some rash action. Was it true, he asked her, that the Duce was inflamed as he appeared? She said the Duce was under enormous strain. She said she had never seen him lose control like that in public. Long begged her to tell him such public displays were dangerous. In fact, secret communications were taking place at that time between Mussolini and his generals to commit one of the 20th century's great war crimes. An incident with a downed plane provided the pretext. Italian pilot Tito Maniti experienced engine trouble and was forced to land behind enemy lines. His plane was surrounded as he fired his machine gun. When he ran out of ammunition, he was captured and killed. Before he died, 3 of his fingers were cut off, and he was castrated. His head was displayed in a nearby village. Mussolini and the Italian press were quick to once again accuse the Ethiopians of being savages. The Duce ordered his generals to use chemical weapons to drive back the Ethiopians. General Ross Imru describes the first incident. I had just crossed the Tekezi River. A group of planes appeared on the horizon. However, the aircraft did not drop bombs, but instead curious-looking canisters, which burst open the moment they hit the ground or the water. Before I could grasp what was happening, hundreds of my men had been sprinkled with a strange liquid and were screaming in pain. Their bare hands, feet, and faces were covered with blisters. Those who had drunk from the river writhed around on the ground for hours in their death throes. I had no idea what to say to them or how to combat this burning, deadly rain. The chemical is known as mustard gas. After its horrid use in the trench warfare of World War I, it was universally outlawed in the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which Italy signed. Soldiers whose skin comes into contact with the clothing of other soldiers are also affected with injury and death. It penetrates clothes, so more than exposed skin is contaminated. It causes temporary blindness, blisters in the respiratory system, and can turn the skin blue, orange, red, and pink. Some forms cannot be seen and have no smell. It is a persistent, lingering weapon that can be effective on the ground for weeks. A nurse serving in World War I described the pain. They cannot be bandaged or touched. We cover them with a tent of propped-up sheets. Gas burns must be agonizing because usually the other cases do not complain, even with the worst wounds. But gas cases are invariably beyond endurance, and they cannot help crying out. Thousands of soldiers were contaminated and left dead or wounded. Civilians were sprayed along with the soldiers. Hospitals were bombed. A Red Cross official called it a veritable hell. The reports alarmed the international community, but Italy's propaganda program simply denied the reports. Unlike the Adwa campaign a generation before, the Italian public was not divided over this war effort. The elite were poised to enrich themselves. The common man viewed Ethiopia and its fertile lands as the means to better his way of life. In his early speeches announcing the colonial effort in Ethiopia, Mussolini inspired his people to seize their rewards. Sirens sounded. Church bells pealed throughout Italy, and the population was seized with a fit of nationalistic frenzy. Shouting and cheering, many of them rushed into the streets and squares in a passionate, patriotic stampede, comparable only with the demonstrations before Caesar in the days of the old Roman Empire. The reports of war crimes were dismissed. Despite these horrific chemical attacks, the Ethiopian army somehow continued to score victories. The Italian light tanks struggled against the Ethiopian infantry, which shot through the weapon slits in the armor. General Ross Casa succeeded in dividing the Italian army and was headed toward a strategic advantage. Wave after wave of Ethiopians surged forward to attack the Italian fortifications, and there was a good deal of bloody hand-to-hand fighting, according to A.J. Barker of the Royal Military College of Science. Italian casualties were heavy, 60 officers and 1,000 soldiers. It left the Italians distinctly uneasy, said Barker. So much so now that Mussolini began to consider the possibility of a compromise peace. Months earlier, Roosevelt passed legislation empowering him as U.S. president to enact an oil embargo on Mussolini, the one action that could stop the war. But the Italian propaganda machine trumpeted victory in Abyssinia and duped the international community into believing Italy's triumph was imminent. Breckinridge Long, with Sarfati's encouragement, lobbied FDR to drop the embargo idea. Stronger pressure came from the president's moneyed advisors. The Duce did not like compromise. His response to the Ethiopian surge was to drop more poison gas. Hundreds of planes dumped more than 1,000 tons of the terrible rain on the Ethiopians and their land over a period of several months. 2 of Mussolini's sons flew planes and helped drop the gas canisters, with phosgene and chlorine now used along with mustard gas. Soldiers fled as their bare feet interacted with the chemicals. The Duce shall have Ethiopia, General Rodolfo Graziani famously pronounced, with or without the Ethiopians. Still, the Ethiopians surged forward. Canestraro and Sullivan capture the drama. Badoglio escaped catastrophe by the barest margin, they write. The marshal's men had advanced too confidently. One Italian division was cut off and surrounded. The Ethiopians poured all their reserves into the gap this created. By evening, Badoglio was in despair. His only apparent option was to order a general retreat. To do so meant abandoning huge supplies of ammunition to the enemy. Without those munitions, Badoglio could not defend Eritrea. The Ethiopians would flood into the colony, and any Italians who survived the rout would be driven into the Red Sea. Nonetheless, Badoglio ordered a withdrawal. He saw no alternative. Fortunately for him and for Mussolini's regime, the Marshal staff refused to obey. They simply could not bring themselves to set in motion a massacre of Italian soldiers. They argued strenuously with their commander until he reversed his order. At daybreak, bombers took off with their deadly loads of poison chemicals. For 12 hours, they dropped tons and tons of mustard gas on the advancing Ethiopians. On the ground, the Italian forces fought grimly to hold their positions. A day and another night of bloodshed followed. Finally, the Ethiopians fell back. General Ross Imru escaped death while moving his 10,000 men across a now poisonous river. When they reached their destination, gas wounds and desertions had thinned his army to 300 men. He arrived in Addis Ababa to learn that Emperor Haile Selassie had abandoned the capital. The war was lost by all accounts, as 150,000 Ethiopians were dead, compared to less than 25,000 Italians. With the war appearing to be an inevitable Italian rout, President Franklin Roosevelt decided to halt the sanctions process. Oil would flow. Writes Olah, on this occasion, once again, the interests of American capital invested in oil companies made sure the profitable Italian market was protected. The League of Nations noted and deplored the fascist invasion, but viewed it as a fait accompli, according to Barker. Vittorio Emanuele III was proclaimed the new emperor of Ethiopia. Chapter 11. Throughout history, Ethiopian emperors fought to the death to preserve their 3,000-year-old empire. That was certainly Haile Selassie's plan. In fact, in defending their last stronghold of Addis Ababa, he hurried to the palace roof and began firing an anti-aircraft howitzer as one of his aides watched, stunned that Haile Selassie knew how to operate it. The emperor's next move was confusing to some, especially the European observers. He traveled to Lalibela, a haven of Ethiopian Christian monasteries and a UNESCO World Heritage Site renowned for its churches hewn entirely from rock, a centuries-long process. He prayed with the monks there for 3 days. This was a useless and dangerous diversion, writes secular British historian Barker, yet the impulse reflects the strange and complex character of the Ethiopian emperor. He knelt and began to pray. For 2 days, the head of an empire which was about to topple sought to renew his spiritual strength, and during this time, not a morsel of food or a drop of water passed his lips. Just before Addis Ababa was given up, the emperor summoned his imperial council and announced his plans to defend the capital. To his shock, the council told him he must leave the country, as his death would destroy the spirit of the people. He must survive for Ethiopia to fight another day. The emperor flatly refused. Biographer Osfawosen Asarate explains the role then played by the emperor's top general. Ras Kassah requested a private audience with the emperor. Once they were alone, he impressed upon his cousin that he should leave Ethiopia, he wrote. And because the Italians might be liable at any moment to cut the railway line, there was no time to lose. The emperor should depart at the earliest opportunity. The Times of London correspondent watched him depart the meeting. He was dressed in khaki as a general. His aspect froze my blood. Vigor had left his face, and as he walked forward, he did not seem to know where he was putting his feet. His body was crumpled up, his shoulders drooped. The orders on his tunic concealed a hollow, not a chest. He departed for the ship Enterprise at Djibouti, but the train was stopped halfway by a military escort led by Tekle Hawariat, who had written the Ethiopian Constitution. He boarded the train, strode into the emperor's compartment, and told Haile Selassie, "Your Majesty, an Ethiopian emperor does not leave his country in the lurch." He called him a traitor and a coward. But his attempt to get Haile Selassie to reconsider at the 11th hour was to no avail, writes Osfawosen, who also notes that later, during another tumultuous time, Tekle Hawariat himself chose safety by exile. The British ship's captain noticed the emperor looked very tired and had a hunted look in his eye. Asked whether his safety could be guaranteed, the captain replied, "As safe as the Bank of England." This statement brought a hint of a smile, the emperor's first in a long while. "I have seldom been impressed by any man, black or white," the captain said later, and his consideration, courtesy, and above all his dignity has left a very deep impression on every officer and man in my ship. The emperor's dignity remained because he was not fleeing the country for his safety. Like at Mekelle and Adwa, he was avoiding the direct confrontation his enemy preferred, and was attacking instead with a clever alternative. At Fort Mekelle, his father Makonnen and Emperor Menelik blocked the spring that watered the fort rather than continuing an attack on the fortification. At Adwa, Menelik and Makonnen circumvented the heavily fortified Adigrat stronghold and instead drew the Italians out into the open field, a clever strategic move that impressed tacticians across the world. Like these two great Ethiopian military leaders, Haile Selassie was choosing to avoid a direct confrontation. He was headed to fight for his country at a higher level, where he would be mocked, insulted, physically threatened, and blocked at every turn. His imperial council had in fact charged him to appear before the League of Nations itself and plead the case of the Ethiopian people. No head of state had ever addressed the League. Haile Selassie had just appeared on the cover of Time magazine as its Man of the Year. Such an appearance in Europe by a now internationally famous world leader would be a terrible embarrassment to Britain, France, and the nations working with all their skills to cover up the failure of the League to follow its charter. But Western Europe greatly feared the rising German superpower and was willing to betray Ethiopia to keep Mussolini from joining forces with Hitler. Meanwhile, the Duce gave the greatest oration of his career, entitled The Proclamation of the Empire. The 6 lions on the grounds of the Ethiopian emperor's palace were shot dead. In Rome, the famous artist Martini sculpted The Hero Subdues the Lion of Judah, while a mosaic by the artist Cerrone praised the triumph of Italy. Mussolini's title was changed from head of government to founder of the empire. He spoke from his balcony. Ethiopia belongs to Italy. It belongs by deed, since our victorious troops have occupied it, and by right, since the Roman sword has brought civilization to triumph over barbarity. The Allies expected Emperor Haile Selassie to concede the defeat and solve their many problems. Mussolini was demanding such a concession, and the Italian propaganda was effective in persuading Europe that Ethiopia had given up on a hopeless effort. However, an appearance before the League of Nations on the world stage by the Ethiopian emperor himself would destroy that clever deception. A serpent has been the enemy of Ethiopia since its very beginnings. It takes the form of a giant snake in its legends and acts in a more sinister ideological form to its west, with the ability to kill not just the body, but also the soul. As I traveled with my guide Jirga to the Debra Monastery, an hour outside Aksum, he asked me an offhand question. "Mr. Dean, do you like to take hikes?" I wasn't sure what hiking had to do with the monastery, Ethiopia's oldest, built on a spot that had previously been a site for ancient serpent worship. "I don't really like to hike," I told Jirga, "but I can do it if necessary." He nodded his head and said nothing, and exchanged glances with our driver. As we approached a several-acre rock formation that juts immediately upward from the ground and walked past the donkeys and goats along the path, we arrived at the entrance to the Debra Monastery. In fact, there was no entrance on the ground. The entrance stood some 300 feet straight up a cliff. At the top, a monk in an orange robe and hat crouched, holding on to a single rope. "You will have to hike up the rope," Jirga informed me. As a consolation, someone tied another rope to me that might prevent a full fall if I were to let go. Hopefully the person holding it at the top would not let go. I began my ascent, criticizing my 53-year-old gray-bearded self for being out of shape. Halfway up, my heart was beating too fast. I was trapped between continuing upward and retreating back down, not sure if I could do either, and sincerely wondering if I would survive. Many people were shouting from the top and the bottom, some in English, but most of it unintelligible. A group of young Ethiopians were laughing. Debra was founded by Saint Aragawe in the 6th century, one of the famous 9 saints of Ethiopia, who covenanted together in Byzantium to travel to Abyssinia and start a monastic movement. When Aragawe first climbed the cliff, he had a similar problem to mine. Just as he was about to fall to his death, according to church tradition, a giant serpent coiled down from above, grabbed him up, and helped him reach the top. Icons of this snake as he assists Aragawe are showcased throughout Ethiopia. A serpent is depicted on one of Aksum's famous obelisks. According to legend, the first king of Ethiopia was the son of a serpent, his father a python, his mother human. His name was Arwe, and the worship of this human reptilian included offering each day a beautiful young girl as a sacrifice. According to a church publication, this first king was the 35th descendant of Adam. Some of these kings lived 300 or 400 years. After 40 years of the first king Arwe's tyrannical rule, a warrior named Angabo plotted to kill him by poisoning a sheep the king ate. Angabo took over as the new king and married Arwe's sister. The Tarik Negus Chronicle provides the line of Ethiopian kings from Arwe to Menelik I, Solomon's son. For my part, I prayed for help to make it up the cliff. I even hoped a giant snake might help me out. Finally, with a bit of encouragement and rope pulling from up top, I made it over the cliff after about a half hour of struggle. The youngsters cheered. Jirga then took me to the monastery chapel, where we took off our shoes before entering. We met a leading monk there named Abba Kuros, who showed us some ancient manuscripts. He told me Saint Aragawi was the son of a king. The saint chose this spot for his monastery because this location was shining more than 7 times the normal sunshine. Then the serpent helped him, and he brought him upright. It was a very big serpent, about 30 meters. I had many questions for him. He was used to skeptics. I told you that we have a lot of miracles, no matter what people say about it, scientists, believers, unbelievers. I asked him if he had any other information about the giant snake that once lived there. The serpent is still alive, he said, underground. While a girl-eating serpent king no longer haunts Ethiopians, the serpent of European rationalism attacks the ancient Christian civilization in a much more dangerous and destructive way. Unlike the generous Ethiopian scholars' view towards oral history, Western logic is harsh and insists on scientific rigor. Its ruthless demands for analytical truth attack the very soul of the Ethiopian religious practice, and more particularly, the existence of the Ark of the Covenant. The history of the world travels from east to west, for Europe is absolutely the end of history, wrote the great Western rationalist Friedrich Hegel. The East, for Hegel and his ilk, did not include Africa, a people that European rationalists still considered under childlike and traditional mindsets. It was under this backdrop that I entered a classroom of the Holy Trinity Theological College in Addis Ababa and prepared to speak to 100 graduate students about my intentions to write a history of their great country. "From whose perspective will you write it?" asked several students, with a tinge of indignation. "Will it be an Ethiopian perspective or European?" Were they asking me if I was going to demand Western rationality and logic in my assessments, or were they saying something else? It wasn't the first time I had been confronted with the issue. I was challenged in the same way by Dr. Tekla Himeno Gabriselassie when we met over a cup of coffee in the basement of what used to be Haile Selassie's palace. Trained at Northwestern University in Chicago, the former chairman of the history department at Addis Ababa University mapped out on a napkin the 3 monasteries that I should visit while in Aksum. Then he challenged me not to be Eurocentric. Asked what that meant, he referred me to the work of an Ethiopian professor at Dayton University in Ohio with a doctorate from France. Messe Kebeda's paper on Eurocentrism makes some interesting points. But the main idea is that historical development should not always be measured by progress or by economic or technological advancement. Other standards exist by which to measure history. He notes that the Ethiopians have had an interest very different, if not more important, than the Europeans, preserving traditional Christian beliefs while surrounded by antagonistic cultures. By this measure, they have performed quite well, says Messe Kebeda, whose references to Marx suggest he is not necessarily coming from a perspective friendly only to conservatives. One might sum up his views with a famous quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "There is more to life than increasing its speed." The development of commerce would not have stopped Islam, writes Messe. On the contrary, a trading society would have quickly succumbed to Islamic appeals. From the viewpoint of non-Westernized Ethiopians, Ethiopian history is therefore a success story. Ethiopians sacrificed wealth and the refinements of civilization, even opted for isolation to make sure they remained faithful to their vocation. All this information I juggled in my head when discussing issues of Ethiopian history with my Ethiopian friends, always hoping I would be viewing things from an Ethiopian perspective. I sat down over coffee with two friends who were students at the seminary, Bazian, the Toronto transplant they call the King, and Elias, the student coordinator for 3,000 seminarians. What do you make of things like the Snake of Deberdamo, which to the modern mind seems crazy? I asked, showing my willingness to question Western rationalism. In the West, they like to say there is one fact and that's it, said Bazian, a deacon and clergyman. But for me, there is both allegorical and historical facts. I mean, the worship of the snake was there in Deberdamo, so that cannot be overlooked. We do see a minimizing of the serpent god as being a tool used by the God of Abraham. Allegory could be put into place, or history. It could be both. It depends on the culture of the people. I was listening. I sort of got it, but sort of didn't. At the risk of showing my Eurocentric perspective, I asked the million-dollar question. But would you say it is true? To help their dilemma, the Ethiopian Church calls the story of Arwe, the first king and reptilian, a legend only. However, the story of Saint Aragawe is read aloud in church annually, as prescribed by the church calendar, the definitive action for whether a story should be believed. So the big snake helping the saint up a cliff is a legitimate faith challenge. Bazian was not willing to discount the story. I don't specifically say one or the other. As a history, it very much could be. But me being 1,500 years later, I cannot say directly with a full answer, but both are possible. Elias, shorter with glasses and a chemical engineer, was less nuanced in his answer. It's all true for me, he said. If I believe the talking donkey story in the Bible, why not? It's possible. Anything is possible for God. The church affirms it and accepts it. And if it is found in the church, it is right. Elias was getting at the real issue, science, or what we see, versus revealed religion. The Bible says we live by faith, not by sight. Traditional Christians, Orthodox, Catholic, Ethiopian, and modern Protestant believers in the Bible all choose to believe what is written and revealed over what science theorizes. We all hope that certain alleged facts are not incontrovertible proofs to contradict the faith. We hope that they are still only alleged, and time will prove otherwise. Faith does not go well with scientific proof, said Ethiopian Patriarch Paulus I. Even Europe's top Ethiopic scholar, Oxford's Edward Ullendorf, when discussing the possibility of archaeological confirmation of the Shiva story, acknowledged that such confirmation has indeed happened in many other biblical stories. Science really has no way of proving or disproving whether a giant snake helped a man up a cliff at the Deberdama Monastery. However, Elias and Bazian get some help from ancient history. Reputable scholar Diodorus Siculus, a Greek in Sicily, reports in the 1st century BC that Ethiopia battled against snakes that were, quote, 30 cubits long, and ate oxen, bulls, and elephants. And almost as if Bazian and Elias had slipped him a $20 bill, he adds, "It is not fair to doubt the word of the Ethiopians, or to assume that the report which they circulated far and wide was a mere fiction." Did a snake really help a man up a cliff? The answer has few consequences for most Christians worldwide. But the bigger question of the Ark of the Covenant is much different. All Christians share in the belief of Moses' golden box. All Christians acknowledge this object as central to Old Testament worship of Yahweh God. All Christians understand its powers. Does it really exist today? Could it really be in Ethiopia? This question has tangible and fascinating ramifications. Bazian and Elias have no doubt about the Ark of the Covenant's existence in Ethiopia. Neither does their professor, Girma Batu. It's like an American doubting the existence of George Washington or the Declaration of Independence, which, unlike the Ark, you can actually go and see, but for me it was quite faded and almost impossible to read. Some observers are not so enthusiastic about Ethiopia's Ark claim. Eritrean historian Michaela Wrong expected a more sophisticated answer when she asked the question to a manager of a computer school in Tigray. "Where else would it be?" he replied. Michaela writes, "What is unnerving about the Queen of Sheba legend is that it is not a quaint historical tale." She notes that the claim that Ethiopia's emperors are descended from Sheba and Solomon was actually enshrined in the country's constitution. Haile Selassie was still insisting on his direct link with the deity in the middle of the 20th century, era of television, the combustion engine, and the jet plane. The weighty criticisms of Ethiopia's Ark claims by Dr. Randall Price are more substantial than mere modernistic contempt. He uses historical and biblical evidence to make his argument against it. Regardless of what is in the Aksum Chapel, he writes in his book, Searching for the Ark of the Covenant, Ethiopians still believe it is the Ark. He is a card-carrying Bible believer, professor at Liberty University, founder of World of the Bible Ministries, and producer of the video The Bible on Trial, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. He is described as a Christian Zionist, having taken 107 trips to Israel and directed excavations at the Qumran Plateau, site of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He has authored 30 books and written for the magazine Israel, My Glory. He is solidly credentialed with a doctorate from the University of Texas in Middle Eastern Studies. Price's first argument is that there is no written documentation of the claim of the Ark being in Ethiopia until the end of the 13th century AD. When this documentation does appear, it deals with a conflict between two dynasties, one claiming Jewish lineage from Moses' wife, and the other claiming to be descended from Solomon and Sheba. Jews were a threat, writes Zionist Price, who rejects what he calls replacement theology. The view that Christianity replaced Israel as God's chosen people is the perspective in the Kibra Nagast, he writes. This viewpoint supports a medieval date of the legend's origin and points to a political and religious rivalry as its cause. Thus, Price and others place a 14th century date on the composition of the Kibra Nagast, 2,500 years after Ethiopians allege it was written. One of the strongest arguments for the Ethiopian Ark story is the existence of the, quote, black Jews, unquote, a group also called Beta Israel or Phoenicia Jews in Ethiopia. Today there are just a few thousand hidden in the northern mountains, but these Jews were once a dynasty in Ethiopia for a short time, 500 years ago. Why are they there? How did they possibly get there? According to a highly credentialed Ethiopian scholar, Sergiu Haile Selassie, the existence in Ethiopia of a Jewish religious community, the Phoenicia, with all its archaic ritual and religious practices, is a fact. He goes on to quote another scholar, Samuel Mercer. They know nothing of the Babylonian captivity nor of the Talmud, but they live according to the laws of Moses, and they call themselves the House of Israel. Their authenticity was confirmed in the 1980s when Israeli rabbis deemed the Phoenicians as true Jews, making them eligible for the law of return and Israeli citizenship, one of the reasons for their dwindling numbers. Price is unfazed by this anomalous sect of Jews in Ethiopia and sees no connection to the Ark or the Solomon and Sheba story. He says Ethiopian Jewry is 600 years old at the most, citing the work of Dr. Stephen Kaplan of Hebrew University, the Beta Israel in Ethiopia. Therefore, the Kibra Nagast and the Solomon and Sheba Ark legend can be traced to a political and religious conflict in the 14th century after Christ, says Price. Price has impressive credentials. it would be difficult to out-credential him in areas related to where the Ark resides today. But there is, in fact, a scholar who can do this, and his views are friendlier to the Ethiopian claims. British scholar Edward Ollendorff taught himself Hebrew and Arabic at age 15, received his doctorate from Oxford, studied also at St. Andrews and Hebrew University, and edited manuscripts at the Cambridge Library. To honor the late professor, the British Academy established the annual Edward Ollendorff Award in 2012 for scholarly distinction in Semitic languages and Ethiopian studies. Unlike the Zionist Randall Price, Ollendorff may have run afoul of zealous Israelis during his years at Hebrew University, where he was known to show compassion to the Arabs in Jerusalem, and was often found discussing Palestinian politics. He titled his memoir, The Two Zions, tipping his hat to the Ethiopian Jerusalem. In his works, Ollendorff never comes out directly to give his opinion on an Ethiopian ark, but he does go out of his way to be generous to such a view. He clearly loves Ethiopia, calling its beauty stark and overpowering, and its people a handsome race, elegant, subtle, and nervous. That last quip was likely related to his years in Ethiopia during troublesome times. In a picture with Haile Selassie, he notes that of the 11 leaders he was standing with, at least 6 had been murdered. He said, "The emperor's slight figure was in marked contrast to the overpowering impact of his personality." Ollendorff also had a bit of a sense of humor. Along with many books on Ethiopia, the ancient Gaze language, and the Book of Enoch, he wrote The Body Bible, which explores the Hebrew Bible's unabashed outspokenness on sexual matters. While Price sees a negative implication in the 14th century being the earliest mention of the Ark in Ethiopia, Ollendorff views this event with a half-glass-full attitude. This first mention in the late Middle Ages comes from Abu al-Makaram, a priest in the Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria, in his noteworthy work, History of Churches and Monasteries of Egypt and Some Neighboring Countries. Apparently, Abu al-Makaram found a way to get a glimpse of the Ark. He writes, "The Abyssinians possess the Ark of the Covenant, in which are the 2 tables of stone inscribed by the finger of God with the commandments which he ordained for the children of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant is placed upon the altar, but it is not so wide as the altar. It is as high as the knee of a man and is overlaid with gold." Ollendorff looks at this description and compares it with passages in Exodus 25 and Deuteronomy 10. He writes, "This description clearly shows the marked resemblance to the Old Testament Ark of the Covenant." Regarding any documentation of the Ark before this first known event with Abu al-Makaram in the late 1300s, Ollendorff uses a creative angle to reach his belief of a much earlier existence. He notes that the Old Testament priesthood rituals in the country, the Ethiopian Ark claim, and the consciousness of having inherited from Israel the legitimate claim to be regarded as the chosen people of God, all these must have evolved in a solid way before the accepted dating of Christianity coming to Ethiopia in AD 325. According to Ollendorff, this conclusion means Ethiopian Ark ceremonies took place at least 1,000 years earlier than Price's 14th century date. Why does Ollendorff believe this? Because in those days, no Christian society wanted any association with Jews and Judaism. For it seems difficult to imagine that a people recently converted to Christianity, not by a Christian Jew, but by a Syrian missionary, Frumentius, should thereafter have begun to boast of Jewish descent and to insist on Hebraic customs and institutions. For Ollendorff, this means that the Ark phenomenon was a part of Ethiopia well before the 4th century. The 4th century. Chapter 12. When my Ethiopian tour guide, Yerga, announced that we were heading to the Pantaleon Monastery. I figured it would not be too long of a trip, as the map showed that it was only 3 miles from where I was staying in Aksum. He failed to tell me that we were not driving, but walking, and that the building sits atop a hill that might be considered a mountain. At least it wasn't a cliff like Debradamo, but the, quote, hike was much longer. As it was a Sunday, along the way we saw Ethiopians headed to church by the thousands, mostly young people, an unusual sight for this Westerner. All of the women were wearing white head coverings, and many of the men wore white prayer robes. The dynamic crowd moved with a certain rhythm. Drum beats, though more modest and subtle than what we would expect in Africa, were an important part of the ritual walk up the hill to the various churches that are being attended on higher ground. Services last for hours. Upon reaching the very top of the small mountain, Jurga took me to the chapel and showed me several 8-inch diameter holes in the natural rock flooring just outside the entrance. They were used for animal sacrifices before the site was Christianized, he told me, and the blood flowed into the holes. When we visited the monks, I was shown old crosses and crowns, and specifically a rock fragment on which was ancient lettering. The Sabaean script reads DMT and provides the earliest documentation known for the Damat civilization that existed in Ethiopia either before or alongside the ancient Aksumite Empire. There also exists an incense burner with BR inscribed on it. Were these people Jewish or part Jewish? Dr. Bernard Lehman and other scholars suggest that BR stands for Hebrew, which stems from the biblical name Eber, Abraham's ancestor. As ancient languages did not have vowels, BR is how Eber is configured in the Hebrew script. Lehman contends that this inscription is the world's oldest mention of the Hebrew people. He recruits Ollendorf into his corner, stating that the Oxford scholar believes that maybe half of Ethiopia's population was Israelite when Christianity was introduced. Ollendorf agrees with the skeptic Randall Price that the Kebra Nagast was published in the 14th century and its purpose included a confirmation of the Solomonic Empire in Ethiopia. Church authorities also agree. However, he says, its author, Yishak of Aksum, was thus mainly a redactor and interpreter of material which had long been known, but had not until then found a coordinating hand, an expository mind, and a great national need. The Kebra Nagast is not merely a literary work, but, as the Old Testament to the Hebrews and the Quran to the Arabs, it is the repository of Ethiopian national and religious feelings. Other scholars have pointed out that the Kebra Nagast omits the story of Solomon's 2 sons and their divided kingdom, evidence of a missing ark too important to leave out, unless the Ethiopians left Israel before that event happened, and the first writer of the Kebra Nagast was therefore too far from Israel to hear the story. Writes Lehman, the earliest part is a totally Israelite document known as the Sheba Menelik cycle, and appears to have been originally recorded in Solomon's reign. The second part, the Caleb cycle, was probably written in AD 520 on the eve of the Christian invasion of Jewish Yemen. The Jewish kingdom in Arabic Yemen, just across the Red Sea from Ethiopia, serves as an effective tool for Price to throw a mortal dagger at the Ark theory. He points to scholastic work stating that the Queen of Sheba actually lived in Yemen, not Ethiopia. And in fact, the Bible never associates the queen who visited Solomon with Ethiopia or Cush. We are only given the descriptor Sheba in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to her as Queen of the South. Says Price, Sheba as an Ethiopian is mythical. Historians agree that she was not from Ethiopia but was from Saba in southern Arabia, modern Yemen, and ruled over the Sabaeans. In this view, Sheba is the same word as Saba, where we get Sabaean. Price also points out that Aksum was non-existent in Sheba's day, and even if one looks to nearby Meroe, Sudan, as the ancient Kushite civilization of Sheba, it too was too small to support an empire. Ullendorf equivocates a bit on the issue. It scarcely matters very greatly whether we have to seek the Queen's home in southwest Arabia or in the Horn of Africa, he writes. He seems less interested in attaching Ethiopia's art claim to the Bible and more interested in simply enjoying the legend for its own sake. This mortal wound regarding the location of Sheba is seconded by Graham Hancock, author of the highly popular The Sign and the Seal. He relays his conversations on the matter with a friend, British scholar Dr. Richard Pankhurst, a leading historian of Ethiopia and founder of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University. In my several visits there to meet with the Institute's current director, Pankhurst's large photo loomed prominently over the waiting area. As a historian, Pankhurst could not accept the Kebra Nagast, says Hancock, quote, particularly since the homeland of the Queen of Sheba had almost certainly been located in Arabia and not in Ethiopia at all. To clarify, Hancock asked Pankhurst a direct question. Do you think there's any possibility that what they say might be true? Frankly, no. No possibility at all. As a matter of fact, Aksum didn't even exist in the period when this was supposed to have happened. It simply wasn't there. Pankhurst noted that Aksum wasn't founded until the 2nd or 3rd century BC, 700 years after the Solomon and Sheba story of the Bible. Well, said Hancock, that rather puts paid to the whole story, doesn't it? Yes, said Pankhurst. Then Pankhurst did some equivocating of his own. I expect it's just feasible that the ark could have been brought up to some other place in Ethiopia, which later got mixed up with Aksum in the traditions that have been handed down. There are, however, many other fallacies, anachronisms, and inaccuracies in the legend, which is why no historian or archaeologist worth his salt has ever been prepared to spend time investigating it. Pankhurst throws a lot of water on the ark claim, but scholars like Ullendorf were still able to show a more generous spirit on the matter. Meanwhile, Graham Hancock seized on Pankhurst's olive branch that the ark may have reached Ethiopia centuries later by other means. We will look at his investigation later. Hancock is a bit of a phenomenon. He has sold over 5 million books, including Magicians of the Gods, Supernatural, and Underworld, The Mysterious Origins of Civilization. He deals in speculation, openly and unabashedly. Nevertheless, his 600-page work on Ethiopia and the Ark is highly documented, with the best available sources. I've read it carefully, more than once, and I've studied separately many of the primary sources he cites. His scholarship is conscientious and accurate. Critics, however, are rather harsh. It is true, he spends a decent part of the book chasing some strange connections between the Ark, the Knights Templar, and the Holy Grail. What the critics fail to appreciate is that he makes it clear all the way through when he is speculating and going down an adventurous rabbit trail, and when he is being factual. It's carefully done. He does make the book fabulously entertaining. In all my years, I've come across very few authors like Graham Hancock who can use story structure to make nonfiction a thrilling read. This not only takes talent, it takes a heart of service and is a labor of love for the reader. I have some of my own bones to pick with Hancock, as I will share later, but as a fellow writer, I can only admire what he has achieved. Price does not agree with Hancock's views. Ullendorf has a clear disdain for him. The popular author's case with the proper British scholar was likely not helped when Hancock's book became an international bestseller in 1992. One paper called it a first-class detective story, and the Seattle Times dubbed it a great intellectual detective yarn. I suppose yarns are not what certain scholars are looking for, not in circles where academic protocol is what determines credibility. Ullendorf told the Los Angeles Times that The Sign and the Seal was, quote, a sad joke. Despite the dispersions, Hancock emerged in an instant with far greater name recognition than any other expert on Ethiopia. For whatever reason, a retired Ollendorff decided to take the gloves off and end his formal friendliness and generosity toward the Ethiopian arc theory. Hancock must be confronted. "I wasted a lot of time reading it," Ollendorff said. The Los Angeles Times reporter asked Ollendorff, "Does anybody really know what lies behind the curtains of the chapel?" "They have a wooden box, but it's empty," he said. "Middle to late medieval construction when these were fabricated ad hoc." "How do you know?" "I've seen it," said the 72-year-old scholar, who failed to share that fact during his many decades of writing up to that point. "There was no problem getting access when I saw it in 1941. Ollendorff's comments and Price's exposure of the Arabian Sheba pose some difficult challenges for those like me attempting to view the country's history from an Ethiopian perspective. Nevertheless, as a believer in revealed religion, I am used to waiting out certain debunkers until the facts conform to the ancient teaching. Although historical and scriptural support looked to be waning, I saw nothing in the scripture that contradicted the Kibra Nagast. I decided to keep waiting. Price does not attack Hancock for his popularity. The Liberty University professor has peddled 30 books himself over the years. He disagrees with some of Hancock's biblical interpretations. For the arc theory, he resorted to a bit of ridicule. The Kibra Nagast attributes magical powers to King Solomon, as well as the ability to talk with birds and animals, and to create a flying vessel as a gift for the Queen of Sheba, Price says. The Archangel Michael flew over Menelik's party and parted the sea so they could march on dry ground. The legend states that the ark destroyed all of Egypt's idols as it flew overhead, and that without the ark to magically supply Solomon's wisdom, he became foolish and idolatrous. This rant is strange for a man who founded the World of the Bible Ministries. The good book tells us that Solomon does, in fact, turn idolatrous later in life. The ark, according to the Bible, destroyed Philistine idols when they came near. An animal talked to Balaam in the book of Numbers, and Elijah flies in a chariot. Angels already caused a group to pass over the sea on dry ground at least once in history, according to the Bible, arguably twice. The Bible man seems to have a problem with miracles. I don't. However, Dr. Price made my quest much more difficult when citing a verse about King Josiah in the Old Testament. The materials I had read all stated that the ark generally disappears in the Old Testament after Solomon. It basically is not mentioned. This is one of the very curious matters for biblical scholars that helps raise eyebrows and give some traction to considering the Kibra Nagast theory. But the key words are generally and basically because there is one verse that does in fact mention the ark, and it only takes one. This verse deals with a historical period 350 years after Solomon and Sheba. In one of the last parts of the Old Testament, chronologically, King Josiah gives this command to his priests in 2 Chronicles 35:3. Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders. Here in 622 BC, King Josiah commands the ark to be placed back into the temple. This contradiction to the Kibra Nagast's claim of the ark leaving Jerusalem and going to Ethiopia 400 years earlier, a contradiction to the story so beloved and embraced by my Ethiopian friends, did not simply create a problem related to believing in miracles. This conflicting testimony was Scripture itself, indicating the existence of the ark in Jerusalem, not in Ethiopia. For me, either the Bible is true or the Kibra Nagast is true. When I first met Professor Guillermo Batu, overseeing 3,000 students as Vice Academic Dean of the Holy Trinity Theological College, we had lunch at one of Addis Abeba's nicer restaurants. Lucy it is named after the alleged prehistoric human bones discovered in Ethiopia. He is the scholar mentioned at the very beginning of this book, and he is polite and gentle like most Ethiopians. He is also highly credentialed. After a nice meal and a time of getting to know each other, I shared my dilemma. I want to believe the Kibra Nagast, the story about Sheba and Menelik and their bringing the ark to Ethiopia. But the Bible says in 2 Chronicles 35:3 that King Josiah had the ark brought out. Therefore, the ark was in Jerusalem, not Ethiopia. I can't get past that. He nodded his head and said nothing. Chapter 13. Haile Selassie was snubbed by the British elite. Upon departing from the French port of Djibouti on the British ship Enterprise, he sailed 2 days to Jerusalem, where he dispatched a telegram to the League of Nations announcing his need for a time of exile. He waited to announce his intentions to address the League of Nations itself. He then sailed toward England, but the British exchanged his ship for a more ordinary vessel to downplay the emperor's landing, a ruse by the British royalty to avoid giving him a formal reception. In a private meeting with Britain's Foreign Secretary, Haile Selassie requested a meeting with King Edward VIII. The British monarch stubbornly refused to receive the emperor at Buckingham Palace, wrote Oswald. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, also went to great lengths to avoid meeting him. Time magazine referred to Haile Selassie as the Lion Incognito. Upon learning the emperor's intentions, the British government exerted all its diplomatic means to keep him from traveling in person to Geneva, Switzerland, to plead Ethiopia's case to the League of Nations. "Tell your emperor," Foreign Minister Anthony Eden informed Haile Selassie's ambassador, "that no head of state has ever addressed the League. It would be unprecedented. The emperor really must not appear. It would compromise his imperial dignity." Mussolini insisted that there was no resistance left. "I have dismantled the government of Ethiopia," he wrote to the League of Nations. "The representatives of a vanquished country should not be present in the Geneva Assembly." Haile Selassie said the opposite in his press statements. "It has been evident that world opinion has been in part duped. Guerrilla warfare was being fought against the Italians all across the country," he said, "only 1/3 of which the Italians occupied. Even that can only be defended by the Air Force and mustard gas. Italy also distributes leaflets from the air," Haile Selassie said, claiming that the imperial Ethiopian government does not exist and presents me to the public as if I have abandoned my responsibilities and mission. By means of such sinister acts, it consistently strives to mislead and misinform the people. League members were cornered. On the one hand, they were working with all their might to keep Mussolini happy and away from Hitler. The joining of forces of these two dictators might defeat the Allies in a world war. On the other hand, betraying a smaller nation like Ethiopia ruined the moral authority of the League to act against the Führer if he invaded European countries as he had been threatening. Hitler had been observing these events carefully, write Canestraro and Phillips. Mussolini had defied the League, disregarded French pleas, withstood British threats, frustrated Roosevelt's political maneuvers, and gone on to smash the Ethiopians on the battlefield. Hitler's admiration for Mussolini soared, while his contempt for the Western democracies increased. "The whole world lives in imminent fear of war," Haile Selassie's Ethiopian advisor in Britain told him. "As a guest, Your Majesty should not be involved in anything that would give the impression that Your Majesty was participating in politics." He also told him that member states were discussing whether the emperor had any authority left, and if on that basis he could be barred from Geneva. "Your Majesty should know that British lawyers are searching for ways to prevent you or your envoys from appearing at the League." Haile Selassie refused to back down. "I will not lose hope in the return of my country's independence because I believe that in the end, God's judgment will eventually visit the weak and the mighty alike, according to what each deserves." He embarked on the trip to Geneva, even though the times were insecure, as he noted, We passed through France, and while we stayed in Switzerland, the two governments afforded us the utmost protection and care. Security agents joined hands and stood around us like a fence so nobody could come close to us. Motorcycle police rode on our left and right to offer protection. Just before the emperor was scheduled to address the Great Assembly, a letter was read from the podium. Italy considers it an honor to inform the League of Nations about her efforts to civilize Ethiopia, the official statement asserted. Italy sees this as her sacred duty. As speakers were called on for discussion, not only was oil still not part of the official sanctions, but the matter being discussed on the floor was the removal of the sanctions altogether. Haile Selassie was asking for financial help to fund the resistance movement in Ethiopia. It was now time for the African spokesman to address the world. He prepared his speech in French, but at the last minute reached for his Amharic script to deliver the historic speech in his native tongue. Writes Barker, Haile Selassie stood before the microphone in the Great Assembly Hall in Geneva. There was a breathless hush as the eyes of all present turned to the slight, diminutive figure in a voluminous black cloak. But the President, Van Zeelen, had hardly given him the signal to speak when pandemonium broke out in the auditorium. The uproar was caused by 20 or so Italian journalists booing, jeering, and yelling insults at the emperor. As Haile Selassie stood there impassively, waiting for order to be restored, Titulescu, the Romanian chairman, jumped to his feet and shouted, "A la porte les savages!" Translated, "The savages are at the door." More mayhem broke out, and it took 10 minutes for the Swiss police to remove the agitators. As soon as they were ejected, the emperor began his speech. I, Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, am here today to claim the justice which is due to my people, and the assistance promised to it 8 months ago, when 50 nations asserted that an aggression had been committed. I assert that the problem submitted to the Assembly today is a much wider one than the removal of sanctions. It is not merely a settlement of Italian aggression. It is collective. It is the very existence of the League of Nations. He turned to the delegates and asked them not to recognize an Italian conquest. Representatives of the world, I have come to Geneva to discharge in your midst the most painful of the duties of a head of state. What reply shall I take back to my people? The emperor's solemn speech was greeted with enthusiastic applause. Everyone agreed that it was a great speech, wrote Time magazine. One of the noblest, most factual, irrefutable, and moving ever made before the League of Nations. That same month, Mussolini ordered that any Ethiopians who were captured and did not surrender must be executed. An Italian paper applauded. The crack of the firing squad's rifles was a burst of defiant fascist laughter at the world that so sanctimoniously condemns us, a shot of defiance to the powers who impose sanctions on us. The emperor explained what was happening. Mussolini began to jeer and insult the League of Nations, saying its charter and procedures were useless pieces of paper and that the League was a useless forum for bickering. As a result of these abusive and inflammatory words, many countries began to shiver vividly. The great nations were listening to Mussolini. Less than 2 weeks after Haile Selassie's historic speech, the Ethiopian resolution in the League of Nations was defeated. Sanctions were officially dropped in all areas of commerce, including oil, the most strategic and important. The British fleet was recalled from the Mediterranean. The emperor's words were totally without effect on Geneva's slick, hard, slippery statesmen, wrote Time magazine. Said Barker, Haile Selassie had a pathetic faith in the League of Nations. Mussolini's victory over the emperor and the League of Nations seemed to be complete. However, the small nations were listening to Haile Selassie. His boldness in appearing before the League broke all tradition in the pattern of relations between European and African peoples. It is the value of promises made to small states that their integrity and their independence shall be respected. In a word, it is international morality that is at stake, said the Ethiopian spokesman for Greater Africa and all Third World countries. Then he delivered a powerful statement, but also ironic for an Ethiopian, as we shall later discover. Apart from the kingdom of our Lord, there is not on this earth any nation that is superior to any other. Ghana's president was furious with the League, which he said had declared war on me personally, and he condemned the wickedness of colonialism. Later assemblies were ominous. These were wretched days at Geneva, noted Britain's League representative Anthony Eden, a future prime minister. One morning during an assembly session about Abyssinia, I suddenly heard a shot and saw a figure fall on the benches at my right hand, he wrote. A Czech spectator had shot himself dead after a cry of warning, apparently about the fate of small countries. His death was a message to his countrymen, sealed with his life. Mussolini was intent on getting Haile Selassie to formally concede his defeat. It is because of you that I am unable to obtain recognition for Italy's claim on Ethiopia, the Duce said in a delivered message. Sign a statement and release your claim over Ethiopia in favor of me. Financial compensation was implied for the emperor, who now lived in a cold, small country home in Bath, England, a world away from his former palace life with many servants. I rejected whatever gifts, material benefits, or political positions that were offered to me to enhance my personal well-being, he wrote regarding his time in exile. My faith lies in the justness and power of the Almighty God. Italian General Rodolfo Graziani intended to carry out to the full the Duce's wishes for more executions. He spared the life of General Ras Imru, who went to a prison in Italy, but his two sons, who led an attack on Addis Ababa, were executed, both shot in the town square. Ras Kassa's two sons, Dejesmach Abera and Dejesmach Asfowosen Kassa, were also taken to the highlands and summarily executed. Archbishop Abuna Petros, accused of inspiring these young officers to attack the Italian strongholds, was executed publicly in the Addis marketplace. Mussolini was in a rush for formal recognition. It took us 7 months to conquer the empire, he declared, but to occupy and pacify it will take far less time. Graziani then launched a campaign with the vague title, Operations of the Great Colonial Policy. Haile Selassie, in his autobiography, describes this operation, beginning with the stealing of an ancient and historic obelisk which a previous emperor erected 1,600 years ago. Executions, including that of Archbishop Petros and other Ethiopian clergy, were named, noting that the archbishop was killed for his refusal to excommunicate Ethiopian soldiers who did not surrender. Prisoners were tortured and burned at the stake, along with the deliberate arson of St. George Church in Addis, along with other churches. Relatives were denied the bodies of slain soldiers, and instead the Italians stacked the bodies and burned them like waste. Unmarried women and those women left with deceased husbands were taken to concentration camps as prostitutes. But the people of Ethiopia were not asking their emperor to back down on the world stage. A captive in Addis wrote to him of their renewed hope when we learned about your majesty's appearance before the League of Nations, holding the scepter of Solomon in your hands. Another leader in Ethiopia wrote, Even if we do not have arms, we prefer to die as heroes, fighting with sticks and stones, rather than dying in cold blood. The stories of valor are numerous. General Afewerk refused to receive treatment after being hit with an artillery gun, even though the wound developed gangrene. He feared his men would lose heart if he left the battle. 48 hours later, he collapsed dead on the field and, as he predicted, the troops scattered. Another officer relayed the story of a general whose army was destroyed. He and his two servants, 3 people altogether, were surrounded. A white came to him and asked, "Are you Dejesmach Balcha?" When he said, "Yes, I am," the white man said, "Surrender your arms and untie your pistol belt." Dejesmach Balcha said, "I am not here to surrender my arms," and he killed the white man. Then he and his 2 servants died instantly without having much suffering. Another captured Ethiopian had a bullet still in his head, with not long to live. They interrogated him. "Who are you?" "The commander of 1,000 men." "Why don't you lay down on that stretcher? The Italians do not harm their prisoners." "I prefer to die on my feet. We swore to the emperor that we would capture your positions or die in the attempt. We have not won, but we have died." He then pointed to the valley scattered with dead bodies. "Look!" Another general, Gabra Mariam, as his army was destructing, ran into the center of the fighting and was shot and killed while celebrating his martyrdom for the bridegroom and shouting, "Today is the day of my wedding." "Some did give in," wrote one survivor. "We surrendered our arms to the Italians when they came because we thought they were protectors of the weak and lovers of justice. But now we see indescribable injustice being done to us." Haile Selassie refused, in part, to officially acknowledge Italy's victory because he had no belief in a humane occupation. In fact, he spoke of the opposite, and rightly so, with General Graziani wiring orders like the following: "We must continue with the work of total destruction." In fact, when the emperor first left his country and sailed to Jerusalem to telegram the League of Nations, he wrote that he had, quote, "chosen to take the road to exile in order that our people shall not be exterminated." Mussolini and the Italians routinely rejected the accusations, but the emperor invoked the words extinction and exterminate several times and discussed the concept in a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury. "We know the Italians are out to destroy our race," he told the head of the Anglican Church. "For the last 3,000 years, Ethiopia has been struggling against paganism, yet it is a sad commentary that today it is denied its own freedom by another Christian people." "This is a question that has deeply affected my conscience," the Archbishop told Haile Selassie. "I beg you not to rub salt into it." He noted that we heard the Pope of Rome had declared legitimacy and recognized the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. Then he promised to meet with the British Prime Minister to inform him of the Italian objective to exterminate your race. These were bold charges. In fact, Italian General Graziani had said, "The Duce shall have Ethiopia with or without the Ethiopians." Could extermination have indeed been the Italian goal, similar to Hitler's goal to rid Germany of the Jews? Official transcriptions of Mussolini's orders to his generals, obtained years later, help provide the answer. 8th July 1936, top secret, to Field Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. Authorization renewed to carry out systematic campaign of terror and extermination against rebel natives and those supporting them. Maximum retaliation, only way to bring situation under control in short time. Confirmation awaited, Mussolini. These were the days of eugenics, and words like extermination were not foreign to scientists looking to purify certain races. The word was also not unknown to Hitler, Mussolini, or the colleagues of Margaret Sanger in America, who targeted the hapless Negroes and other, quote, unfit people. Chapter 14. Sanger was concerned for her Negro project. In 1939, she wrote, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any one of their more rebellious members." In fairness to Sanger, the context involves her recruiting Christian pastors, quote, colored ministers with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities, to travel the country promoting birth control. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through religious appeal, she said. Recruiting ministers was in response to a message from one of the Negro Project directors, Procter & Gamble heir Dr. Clarence Gamble. "There is a great danger that we will fail," Dr. Gamble said, "because the Negroes think it is a plan for extermination. Hence, let's appear to let the colored run it." Was their plan to exterminate, Or were they reacting to the blacks' fears of being exterminated? Either way, the language is disconcerting. Many other Sanger quotes allude to an extermination mentality, and one's pause on the question should not include a belief that Sanger was incapable of such thinking. She wrote in her book, Woman and the New Race, "The most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." In the previously mentioned book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, reviewed by Sanger's lover Havelock Ellis in her Birth Control Review, Ellis shares his concern that colored people in America, quote, "the migrations of lower types even within the white world, such as those which have worked havoc in the United States, must be rigorously curtailed." If total extermination for African Americans was not the goal, partial extermination has been the result so far. When abortion first became legal in New York City in 1970, 43% of the abortions of city residents were performed on non-whites, and 46% on whites, and 10% on Puerto Ricans, even though only 21% of city residents were black, and 77% white. The numbers nationwide are difficult to obtain today. To provide an objective analysis, Life Dynamics Incorporated conducted an exhaustive study in 2011. The report listed all 3,000 clinics in the country that perform or refer for abortions and used the census to identify the white and minority breakdown of every zip code where the clinics exist. Of the 116 zip codes with more than one population control facility, 84 were disproportionately minority zip codes. What this data means is that when the abortion industry places multiple facilities in a zip code, that zip code is more than 2.5 times as likely to be disproportionately minority as not. In other words, minorities, for example, African Americans and Hispanics, make up 35% of the U.S. population. But a zip code with more than one clinic has a 74% chance of being in a disproportionately minority area. In Texas, for example, which has 94 zip codes with at least one population control facility, only 22 are not disproportionately black or Hispanic. In Connecticut, a state thoroughly dissimilar from Texas in size, culture, and geography, there are 21 zip codes in which population control facilities are located, and only 6 are not disproportionately black or Hispanic. In Tennessee, there are 3 Planned Parenthood clinics. The black population in that state is 16.4%, but in the zip codes of Tennessee's 3 clinics, the black population is 42%, 53%, and 56%. The targeting seems more effective with African Americans, whose percentage of the U.S. population decreased slightly from 2000 to 2010, while Hispanics, as a percentage, grew by 25%. Planned Parenthood's historic African American targeting has not escaped the concern of popular culture. NFL player Benjamin Watson said Planned Parenthood was founded to, quote, "exterminate blacks," reported Fox News, which quoted the Baltimore Ravens wide receiver as saying in 2016, "We as minorities support candidates and overwhelmingly support the idea of having Planned Parenthood and the like, and yet that is why she created it. The whole idea with Planned Parenthood and Sanger in the past was to exterminate blacks, and it's kind of ironic that it's working." Mussolini's orders to exterminate Ethiopians may have been intended for certain parts of the population or for only those rebellious members, or, had he had enough time, perhaps he would have exterminated a race with the same intentions as Hitler. We do know that Mussolini was keenly aware of birth rate realities. While he promoted Malthusian fears of overpopulation in Italy in his early radical years, upon becoming prime minister, he made a complete 180-degree turnaround. Regarding the saying, "the Italian population is like a river overflowing its banks," he now insisted, "it is not true. In his famous Ascension Day speech in 1927, the Duce warned of economic doom. "Italy's cribs lay empty," he cried, "while the country's cemeteries grow full." Why the sudden change? Firstly, he envisioned an imminent reproductive war between races, which superior species were destined to lose because of their reluctance to breed, according to Maria Chine's dissertation, From Malthus to Mussolini. Secondly, he was persuaded by the science. Malthusianism made little sense and is denounced by many scholars today. A monstrous doctrine of unreason, notes widely published British historian Paul Johnson, who criticized the Malthusians as not men of action, but men who sat in their studies creating hard-headed and relentless mumbo-jumbo. Malthus's premise was that population doubles every 25 years while food and resources grow by only a few percentage points. He failed to account for human ingenuity and higher production rates. Mussolini pointed out that Italy had far more food in the 1930s than it did with far less people 50 years earlier. Like many scientists awakening today, the Italian demographers warned the Duce that depopulation spelled economic doom. Far from bringing misery, as Malthus had contended, excess population contributed to economic development, according to Italian economist Achille Loria. Rather, more children leads to more economic growth and more productive labor. Italian sociologist Corrado Gini explained how it works on the ground, as conveyed by Chine. Laborers in industry and agriculture with no family or few children, he argued, lacked the motivation needed to endure long hours and bad pay. Prolific fathers made the most productive, deferential, and obedient workers because they faced the difficult task of maintaining a large brood of dependents. Single workers, on the other hand, were more likely to demand better conditions and to go on strike and showed a destructive propensity. Poverty was an effective inducement for workers, according to Gini, a notion as old as Solomon's proverb. It is good for workers to have an appetite. An empty stomach drives them on. Proverbs 16:26. Mussolini was also following another of Solomon's insights. A large population is a king's glory, but without subjects a prince is ruined. Proverbs 14:28. Mussolini wanted an empire and needed a larger army. He passed laws to reach that goal. Bachelors who refused to marry and have children were heavily taxed and prohibited from holding public office. Women were given generous maternity leave. Public employees received bonuses with each child. Abortion and birth control remained illegal. A prolific Mothers of the Year award was given after recommendation letters were received from throughout the country, with the Duce choosing the finalist and presenting the award. A declining population was, quote, demographic decadence that led to bestial corruptions, the Italian government now asserted. Countries that refused to grow were, quote, destined to become a weak and degenerate eunuch race. Margaret Sanger was appalled by Mussolini's battle for the birth rate, as it was called in Italy. She traveled there to campaign for birth control and spoke out against the Duce's more brazen comments about women. He said, "You cannot point to a single instance where a woman has created anything that has been passed down to posterity." In response, Sanger never got around to actually naming any famous female accomplishments. Instead, she gave an ironic biblical response. "Women never created anything," she fumed. "What about babies? What about you, Signor Mussolini? You would not be here to rant and shout, nor we to read and fight, if women had never created anything." She was echoing 1 Corinthians 11:12. "For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God." She gave one more example and continued the irony. "As to women not being creators, shame on Mussolini. Has he forgotten his history? Where are his religious teachings? Does he not know that the Virgin Mary, all by herself and without assistance of man, according to legend, created the leader and founder of Christianity?" she said of the religion she hoped to destroy. This was an act of creation which has changed our civilization for the past 2,000 years. Is this not enough? Despite all of Mussolini's efforts, the birth rate in Italy did not increase. Sanger, while visiting Italy, promoted birth control to an underground movement. And this is perhaps in large measure responsible for the fall in the birth rate, she claimed. Scholars suggest the reason was related to Italy's great wars in Ethiopia and Europe. Regarding another swipe by Mussolini, that women have no wills of their own, Sanger was also outspoken. The women of Italy are silently telling Mussolini what they think of him. They are telling him that there can be no life unless they will it. On this last point, Sanger was 100% correct. The battlefield of the future, and for civilization itself, will be fought in the hearts and minds of its women. General Rodolfo Graziani, under orders from Mussolini for the, quote, extermination against rebel natives in Ethiopia, decided to put a positive face on the Italian regime there and distribute money to the needy at a celebration for the birth of the Prince of Naples. The ceremony was attended by almost all the top-ranking Italian authorities. The poor, of whom there were some 3,000, had just begun to file past the long white table on which the coins were piled, when a hand grenade, hurled by someone hidden in the crowd, exploded just above the gate of the palace. A second later, another bomb burst in the midst of the Italian group, and Graziani fell, wounded in the back. In the next few minutes, 7 more were thrown. The police opened fire immediately. The firing went on for 3 hours, and when it stopped, the compound was littered with bodies. But the worst was yet to come. Later that afternoon, hundreds of black shirts gathered around the palace and then made for the native quarter of Addis Ababa. There they embarked on a systematic massacre, drenching the homes with petrol, setting them alight, and shooting the inhabitants as they emerged from the blazing huts. While this hate ran riot, the police kept out of sight, and the massacre went on for 3 days. Graziani and Mussolini's army did not spare the clerics. An estimated 1,500 to 2,000 monks and clergy had escaped to the Debre Libanos monastery and other monasteries. All were executed, exterminated at the hands of the enemy, according to Haile Selassie's memoir. The monastery was burned to the ground, its treasures looted, and the entire vicinity abandoned and neglected. Ethiopian official Johannes Iyasu wrote to Haile Selassie describing these horrible events. Commanders and soldiers and also young men were rounded up and executed by machine guns without committing any crime. Their wives were raped, and their children were burned alive after being gathered in a house. What came as a great astonishment was the fact that those who submitted themselves to the Italians were the first to be killed. They say Ethiopia is their property, and the Ethiopian people their slaves. They force us to kill each other. They point out that from now on, Ethiopia is for the Italians. It should not be called Ethiopia. From now on, only the white race will be entitled to live in Ethiopia. The black race from now on will not be allowed to live here. The emperor read letters like these from his small living quarters in England. He was alone, as his wife, suffering from rheumatism, found the clammy English climate intolerable. She left for Jerusalem with their son, Haile Selassie. Our life in Bath was very hard, the emperor said. We also encountered great financial difficulties. Some had spread rumors that we had taken a great deal of money with us when leaving the country, but it is a complete lie. What money they did have lasted 1 year. The rest we used to help the exiles. A British film company offered him nearly $2 million in today's money to participate in a movie on his life entitled Escape Under Cover of Darkness. He politely declined. His wife was forced to sell her jewelry along with the imperial silver tableware that they had smuggled out, which included the imperial initials and crown. Mussolini contacted Haile Selassie. "I have heard of your financial predicament. I am willing to buy you a palace in a country of your choice, and in addition, to give 1,000,000 guineas to you, so that together with your family, you can live in peace for the rest of your life off the interest of the original deposit." Again, he asked him to sign a release acknowledging Italian victory. Again, the emperor refused, replying, "The history of Ethiopia will not be despoiled by a guinea stained with the blood of Ethiopians." Haile Selassie was out of money, cold, and alone in a dark place. That winter, the financial situation became so strained that there wasn't even enough money for coal, writes his biographer Osvaldsson. A fire was lit in only a single grate. The barefoot runner could see 2 competitors behind him and 3 in front. Abeba Bikila's shoeless feet pounded the concrete while he continued racing for Ethiopia alongside Roman landmarks in the 1960 Olympic Marathon. After many miles, he had already passed the favorite, the Russian Sergei Popov, along with New Zealand's Barry McGee. Ahead of him were Englishman Arthur Kelly, Aurélie Vandendriessche from Belgium, and a third man he could not identify. He wore number 185, so it wasn't the runner his Swedish trainer, Ani Niskasen, had specifically warned him about, Radi bin Abdesalam, the man who gained recognition in cross-country as a runner under the French flag. Niskanen considered Radi to be the top threat, despite the popular regard for the Russian. Niskanen warned Bikila to specifically watch out for Radi, number 26. This man ahead of him wore number 185, so that was a relief. But who was he? The marathon ended at the Arch of Constantine, immediately next to the Roman Colosseum. All of these structures reminded Bikila of the Italian army that invaded his home village in Ethiopia when he was 3 years old. He did not want to suffer defeat in the land of his invaders. Bikila was a soccer player before he ever considered running, but he traveled 20 kilometers to work, and Niskanen had seen this soldier running from Sololta to Addis and back every day and hit upon the idea of letting him try a marathon. Bikila was interested, his daughter says, because he had seen the nice outfits the 1956 Olympians wore and the trips they enjoyed, so he decided he would also be an Olympian. He said this only to become a laughingstock to his colleagues, she writes. He secretly vowed to himself to work hard and to prepare himself for the competition. His mother did not approve. She believed Olympic dreams were distracting him from a more steady and promising career path. She decided the solution for him was to get married. A wife and family would encourage him to stop wasting so much time at the track. She arranged a marriage with the much younger 15-year-old Ewibdar Wolde Georgis, an accepted practice in Ethiopia. Biographers describe it as a happy union. They remained married their entire lives. Author Paul Rambali recounts this exchange between Bikila and a female American runner. "What's your wife's name?" "Ewibdar." "Ewibdar? That sure is a funny name," she blurted. "Oh, I'm sorry. How did you meet?" "She from village, parents choose, parents find bride." "That's how they do things in Ethiopia? The parents arrange everything?" Abeba nodded. "Where I come from, it's us that chooses. You know, you can marry whoever you want, if he asks you." She paused. "I wish my parents had arranged things for me," she said. "I got a little baby, you see, back home. Only I ain't supposed to say nothing because the baby ain't got a father, legally speaking. They told me not to talk about it with anyone." Bikila and Ewibdar were married on March 16, 1960, just a few months before the Olympic marathon. Now he had a chance to win a medal in the Olympic Games. There had already been some discussion of Ethiopia not competing in the 1964 Olympics due to their lackluster performance in Rome. The marathon was the last event, and still, No Ethiopian had ever won an Olympic medal of any kind. 3 runners were in front of him. If he could only pass just one. During the race, they ran by an obelisk on their right, the very one Mussolini had stolen in 1937 and taken back to Rome, the obelisk of Aksum. The stela stood 80 feet tall, was made from 160 tons of granite, and was over 1,600 years old. Bakila found the inner strength to make a move. He increased his pace. Biographer Rambali quotes a radio commentator, "This really is a surprise. After holding the first 2 places for nearly an hour, the British entrant Kelly has dropped back along with the Belgian Van den Driesch, and it seems that the 2 Europeans have surrendered the lead to 2 unknown runners. It's an astonishing sight, I must say. The Ethiopian, Bakila Abeba, is running barefoot. There's no more than a yard or 2 between them, and that's how it's been for the last 15 minutes. He and the unknown runner were head-to-head in the lead. Who was this number 185? As they made their way toward the final stretch, Niskanen got a message to Bakila. His competitor had been given the wrong number at the beginning of the race. In fact, he was neck and neck with the one athlete Niskanen feared the most, Radi bin Abdesalam. Both runners had seen the doctor that morning, and Radi later gave an account of his chance occasion to look at Bakila's bare extremities, propped up for the doctor to examine. "I was amazed at his feet," said Radi. "The soles of his feet were thick and black as coal. I remember that I wanted to touch his feet, the hard skin of which resembled by its consistency the tires of big military trucks. I was sure that he would feel nothing, but on the contrary, the hard skin was very sensitive." Bakila looked up at him as soon as his skin was touched, although Radi said, "I had hardly brushed it with my finger." Earlier that year, Radi had won the International Cross-Country Championships. He had once represented the French people, but, in fact, was not running for France this time. He represented a North African country. The 2 leading runners, Radi and Bakila, served as a poignant symbol for shifts taking place in what will become a post-European civilization.